Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism slash the Imperial 2000s slash Sad Francisco, whatever we want to whatever we want to call this. First of all, I want to thank Jemma and Mtume because I put them through this. Like, this was not something that either of them volunteered for. And when I brought it up to both of them, they're like, oh, well, that means I have to go watch this movie, which I don't really want to do. So, so just shout out to both of you for participating in this with me. So for folks who don't know, Jemma DeCristo is the author of The Aesthetic Character of Blackness. She is a frequent contributor to the podcast Sad Francisco and an organizer in San Francisco. Thank you for joining us, Jemma. And probably people on this platform are familiar with Mtume Gant because of all the Imperial 80s episodes, but I recognize that this episode may go kind of outside of that sphere. And so, just to say that Mtume is a filmmaker, he's an actor, he's a film studies scholar, author, co-host of the Imperial 80s, and host of the Within Our Gates podcast, among other things. And so both of you wear many hats, and the one I brought you here to join me with is to be haters. And so put on no, but so I thought we would just start because there's like so much discourse around this film, and I don't know. I mean, to some degree, I've questioned of like, oh, did I just stumble upon some terrible algorithm where I'm being brought Odyssey takes every time I log into social media? I think so to some extent, but I also think that there is a whole lot of discourse going on around this film. Obviously, it's been a blockbuster smash. It's going to finish grossing well over $1 billion. Now we'll talk about how much it cost because it's like 375 million in production and promotion or something like that. So, but it's close to $1 billion already after 3 weeks, basically. And but that it's been, getting a lot of accolades from people, and it's also been getting a lot of people who are really mad at it for a variety of different reasons that I don't care about at all, frankly. And I think it's worth us saying a few of the reasons or the things that we're not concerned about with the film, or we're not really criticisms we may have seen that we don't care about, before jumping into the ones that we do. Before we do that, just remind folks, like, share, subscribe, support the channel, check out these other podcasts Within Our Gates, Sad Francisco, see all the work everybody does and support them as well. But yeah, so Jemma, do you want to go first with some like discourse you've seen that you don't care about at all?
Yeah. Okay, my mic's on. Sorry, I have two computer screens in front of me. So thank you for having me. Some people know me from, I think I came on last year and we did the Imperial 80s, and then we talked about my book too, which we'll have to do another Imperial 80s. I have some ideas, which maybe we could talk about after this closes. So yeah, a lot of the big thing we talked about this. I mean, I think you reread the Odyssey, you can correct me, but I just don't, the fidelity to the text argument is not very interesting to me. I know that it tends to be the big topic, and it doesn't super interest me because I think, especially such a canonical work, I'm like, if anything, there are lots of fascinating, I mean, I think of cinema as its own medium, certainly, for better and worse in ways. And then also that people have made really amazing, I mean, you think of like someone like Brecht, it's like, well, okay, there's a lot of takes that are not, about, and a lot of this, we may end up talking about this too, a lot of 70s films, leftist films too, have radical Brechtian and otherwise takes on classical texts that I'm like, I love this movie, it's one of my favorite movies, and, so I don't think that really matters to me. And it also, I think, as far as I understand, that I'm gonna forget the author's name, but the white lady that's in all the interviews,
Emily Wilson.
Okay, I may just refer to her as the white lady in all the
She's been excommunicated from Philly, not for her critique of the Odyssey, but because she said it's like water ice, sugary and lacking nutritional value or something like that, that's just a sin we can't forgive in Philly. So
we can't. Okay, she didn't compare it to Philly cheesesteak, but she can. Yeah, and I think even her version, I think it's called an quote unquote accessible version, right? Too. I kind of have issues too with, we don't even have to go into it. I mean, but like the notion of accessible, and that poetry isn't accessible, but certain kinds of literal languages. This is a whole discourse online, by the way, which you probably have talked about like reading and study and things, which we don't even have to get into. But it's just not a, you kind of get into this like, what's the true, the authenticity discourse of it, which feels very tied to some of the critiques we'll probably talk about, or reference around like civilizational accuracy too. Like a lot of people have talked about the period accuracy of the outfits. These are just not things I care about. And it also is, again, kind of the history of Hollywood filmmaking is not that. Like if we were to think of, I might end up bringing him up later, but like someone like Cecil B. DeMille, like a lot of his films are historically accurate, but there's a lot of interesting to track kind of the like conservative views of the world through these films. They're just not accurate as far as like, oh, people didn't wear that hat in this time period. How dare you? Which it also feels like a lot of those antiquarians tend to have really conservative politics too. So like, it's just not a argument I would super entertain. Whereas I'd be much more like, okay, well, we know this is, cinema is kind of in among other, we could say this of art in general, is this relationship to mystification that this feels like a misdirection, right? Like a lot of the conversations feel like a misdirection about like what we ought to be concerned, which I think is what we're kind of searching after in this. So those are just the ones off the top of my head. You probably can, I think you might talk more about sort of the right wing parts of it, which I just don't see on my side of the internet, but I have seen since you sent them. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is very specific, which we could, we could talk about that, and like the trotting of things, which this is probably related to, and all this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Mtume, do you have some?
I mean, largely similar to Jemma's, but I say, like, generally, I when these kinds of films roll out, I don't like the discourse in their totality, even when they have like elements that should be scrutinized, because I do think there is a way to think about why Nolan chose this smorgasbord of identities throughout the film in a particular way to put out his project. But this just becomes like an Oscars and then a right wing and then a liberal kind of discourse around how we're doing these things. And they just become exhausting. And they happen every year, whether it's a film, whether it's an award show. The conversations seem to be like cyclically stuck, and they're never really that interesting. Yeah, the fidelity thing to the text, which I also find to be a mask of this chaotic idea around authenticity in art and what is authentic, and it's constantly a floating signifier, and no one ever really wants to interrogate that, because I think no one wants to really interrogate like big movies in general, but especially big budget movies as like commodities, and like the kind of idea of commodity exchange and authenticity. Like, no one wants to get into that conversation. And if you bring that in there, then you're like, you get no, like, stop it. You're messing with the sanctity of this great work. And then also, I think probably another discourse that is big and filled with filmmakers is this concept of, is Nolan saving movies? Right, which is also just absolutely annoying. This idea that there is like, movies are like the Titanic, right? And are they sinking? And what do we need to do? And whether you like the film or not, maybe should we be championing Nolan's grandiose attempt to be great? Which, like, I think if you endorse that on any level, you have to start interrogating your relationship to this whole thing, especially if you're someone who considers yourself at least a tad bit progressive, right? To left, to any kind of ist that is on the left, right? I think you have to start interrogating your priorities and your allegiances a little bit. But yeah, those are the things that I'm just never going to really get into that. Or if I get into that, I'm going to have an opinion that's not within the dominant, like, usually there's like a two sides to it, and I don't participate.
Yeah, I mean, I think you all have named pretty much all of the areas that I would name. I don't. I also so there's also one other area is this concern that Nolan doesn't actually show the gods, right? Or an argument that he doesn't show the gods. Again, we can get into that at some point. I do think there's a little bit of chaos in that he, for full disclosure, I've seen the movie 3 times, which is like, I know 2 more than both of you. So, like, I went back to try to find different things within it, you know? But like there are a lot of weight cues that he uses throughout the film to give the audience like there's this thing Tom Holland's character Telemachus is always saying like I see it, you have Athena's eyes, right? Or things like this, which corresponds to points in the Odyssey where, for instance, Athena is actually embodying that character, right? But Nolan doesn't actually, do that, right? Doesn't actually show ever the god's presence in a certain kind of way. He uses thunder a lot to recognize when Zeus is supposed to have a role within the film. He uses, the waves and the wind and stuff like that for Poseidon, right? Which, I mean, in many ways gets closer to kind of something historical, right? Which is to say that the perception of, ancient Greeks or whatever, right, would have been that these things were controlled by different gods. And that was how they, in similar way that modern people would attribute certain things to science, pre-scientific societies would attribute them to deities and so on, right? So like it's not, I don't really have an issue with that. Um, Although I do think, like I said, it's a little chaotic because he does show Cyclops, he does show giants, he does show witches. Well, really, who's really a goddess, right? So, like, there's a way in which it's, to me, as a film, it's a little bit chaotic that way, or not symmetrical or something like that, right? Like, you're sort of moving one of these things off stage while still showing very much the presence of magic, which I think I chalk up to just Nolan's fascination with magic as well, right? Like he's throughout all of his movies, this is like a big thing for him is the trick, right? And the Prestige, of course, being one of his films, but that not just the name, not just the film, the Prestige, but the idea of the Prestige, right? Of like, I'm going to reveal something to you in the final act of the movie. And also, and this is something he spoke about in one of the interviews, this weird thing where, and maybe you all both will have something to say about this as folks who are artists but also critics of art, is wanting to leave art to the interpretation of the audience. So then not, but also being very didactic in a certain way, right? So like I'm going to really lead you towards something, but I'm going to leave enough ambiguity then that people can claim different things. An example of this within Inception, right, is like the spinning of the top at the end and like does it stop, right? Like what really happens at the end, you know? And he says, I always know the answer to these things, but I don't want to tell you, kind of thing. And like to me, that's just like, I don't know. I find that whole thing really annoying, but maybe it's a part of the allure of the artist and the auteur and the, whatever. I don't know if that's part of his thing. But yeah, Mtume, I could tell you want to say something about that.
Well, I'm just going to say something very quickly. Because of this thing that he does, he makes my first year of film production course impossible, because I have to argue with students about this idea of the vagueness of interpretation, or open for interpretation, and because also what you pointed it out, it's fundamentally not true, right? Like with him, and clearly in how he totalizes you with the kind of like sensory overload, particularly not with just this, all of his movies, but this movie in particular, he really kind of like cranked it up. He like was like hitting like 90s miles per hour down, I-95. He was going hard, right? So yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally not true. And Inception, I think, is always a great example, because I've always said that he doesn't earn that ending. Actually, he kind of tacks it on the spinning, but it could be. And I'm like, bruh, like, dog, nothing in the film that preceded that lets you do that other than you tacking on this next little sequence. It's a parlor trick to not be committed to anything, but he's also committed to it very clearly within the narratives and his construction.
People are questioning my life choices.
That's why. Also, work day. Someone said get to work. You need a part-time job, they said.
That is 2 of my production classes. That's crazy.
Two things. Well, one, and we jump into the movie together, but I'll start with where Mtume left off too, is that like, I think, and I'm not like trying to be like some kind of strict formalist, but I imagine you come up against this, Mtume, in your classes. Like, if I were to look at his images, and for those just watching, I'm putting it in quotes because I don't really think he has images in his films. I think it's visuals. I would use the word visuals. It very much reminds me of one of my most hated filmmakers, who maybe will also earn some, because maybe we'll already get a lot of ire for this, is Terrence Malick, who it's like an Instagram reel. I had to rewatch them for this article I'm writing actually about a film, not a Terrence Malick film. And so I think there is this, which Nolan is probably the best embodiment of, and he very much is a synthesis of Hollywood filmmaking too. Like, we were talking in the green room, if you will, about Spielberg, who I think I brought up Zemeckis when I think Jared, you and I were talking, because you all did Back to the Future, which I listened to that one recently. I think that's on a lot of there with the time trap, the device as. I also think he is a lot more like Quentin Tarantino than people would want to admit to, because it's also this kind of gimmickification of cinema, which I think is that it's related to, I wouldn't even, people could call it kind of nihilism or something, but I always think nihilism is a belief in something, like I don't think it exists. Like, I think this is, so people that are like, oh, Tarantino's nihilist, and they find out he's like a fanatical Zionist. Like, you're like, no, actually, let's look at that, if they didn't know that. There's a bunch of things. But with Nolan, I think it's an intentional mystification, which is, I think, what you're alluding to too is paradoxical, because art already does that on some level. You can't control the interpretation of art on some level. We get that, like, you're not doing anything really profound. What I think he's doing is actually, maybe the other side of the magic trick part is implanting this mystification in himself. So people are like, oh, there's a secret meaning. And obviously the person I'm guessing he kind of got that from would be Kubrick, because Kubrick was famously very reclusive. And I think in 2001, he would never tell people what it meant until maybe there is an interview where he does. But we're talking about before social media, because when he died in 99, Kubrick, I think, it was before it was easy to find all this stuff. And it's not like people were going to be digging through film journals unless you were like a super fan. But because Interstellar is obviously the 2001, his attempt at this, which again is him explicitly engaging with, maybe, I guess you would call Kubrick certainly like a Hollywood filmmaker, even though they had a more spurned relationship to it than Nolan, who's like Spielberg. He's like the most influential, that New York magazine, I think I sent Jared, I might have put it in our group document, the most influential director in Hollywood, head of the DGA, which is also something we could talk about. I think is also why I brought up DeMille, because DeMille was also the head of the DGA that led the Red Scare. Which we could bring up AI. There's a bunch of things we can bring up, because he also did an interview where he was like not very condemning of AI, which we can, Mtume would probably know a lot more about these things, being, I don't know if you're in these unions, but I've never have been. So, but yeah, I think the mystification is largely a way to, I think it's a way of like, we could also talk about where auteurism has gone, which I think is what you were talking about, of the saving the art form. And that I think you all didn't do one battle after another on this, but PTA is talked about in very similar. I saw your really, that was an excellent one, Mtume, that you did on another podcast. And I think the way people talk about these white dudes too, specifically, because it's always this kind of guy, like, which again, not that it would be like, oh, it has to be a woman, or it has to be a person of color, like, but it does feel like, there's not really a reckoning with the idea that the so-called auteur has become the brand, and that's really what people are talking about. And that to the extent that the filmmaker as author was at all counter-hegemonic, it has certainly been, like flown has been absorbed by the highest in true neoliberal fashion, right? Everything from below becomes absorbed by that's useful to power becomes absorbed by that. And so it feels very naive. I think when people talk about saving the art form, they're also talking about saving Hollywood, which is something we could also get into. And I don't want to go on too long, but yeah, I could say more about him mystifying his endings. I just also don't think the science parts of it ever make any sense too, which I think is totally fine if you want to make a movie that's not, this is not how time travel works, but what if it did, or whatever, or something like that, even though I also agree with you. I find time travel really lazy and annoying. But that it feels like he wants kind of the authority of popular science, which is another thing we could talk about too, like the Stephen Hawking books that came out in the 80s and Brian Greene and all these kind of like, books that like very History Channel dad too is in there as well. Like, this is how history went. Y'all talk about that a lot in the Imperial 80s. And it's like, no, it's not. I mean, I think Oppenheimer's a great example of History Channel kind of historiography, if you will. But the last thing I'll say is really quickly, just kind of moving towards the movie, and there's more I could say about this period, but the genre of films in Hollywood, and not just Hollywood, they also made them in Italy, things we call peplum, like sword and sandal films, a lot of films about ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, the Romans. Sorry, there's a siren by me. But in other adaptations of the Odyssey, we actually also don't see the gods too, and other sort of similar, like the Iliad or I don't think the Ennead has been, I'm not aware of I think there's an adaptation of that, but we don't often see the gods in that genre. And I think a lot of that also has to do with what people have been questioning about the film, is like a lot of especially the Italian films, I assume some of that is like the Catholicism, the Christianity, and that like, to invest too much in these quote unquote false idols would be kind of a sort of paganism. And it's not that in and of itself is scandalous. I mean, it is perhaps to them, but it also belies what they actually, why this sort of civilizational thinking is being referenced. What do we want these movies to do? And obviously we don't want ancient Greece to bring back the ancient Greek religion. That's usually not what people use it for, per your reference to online conversation. They want it to bring back notions of patriarchy, colonialism, I mean, and there's other, maybe there's other people, there's counter readings. There are, like I think of Pasolini, I think of Straub and Huillet, there's people that are criticizing like the authoritarian reliance on these, probably most famously in the Nazis, but also, also the Romans and the Italians. But yeah, so I think there is some of that in there. Why the gods aren't represented is that they actually, I can't recall too many. Maybe that TV Odyssey had the gods, but yeah.
I think Clash of Titans maybe is one. Like there are some, and it usually goes very poorly. Like usually they're not like popular movies. It's a ton of CGI or like very like it just doesn't, but
or they make them in human form. They just make them human form and we see them, but of course they're deities, in that kind of way. Yeah. No, go ahead, Jay.
There's something I wanted to say. I mean, so you brought up the IG reel comment, and it's very interesting actually because obviously there's a whole lot of techno fetishism going on with this film, like and I'm sure Mtume has thoughts about this. Both of you probably do in general with Nolan. It's not as, I don't know. I think just as a average viewer who's not really never tried to make a movie, right, and that kind of thing, like I don't necessarily think about those things as much, because also like all Hollywood films are inundated with like these short shots and like a lot of like it's very clippy and reaction shots and all this kind of stuff. But interestingly, like he's been on this tour to talk about how it was all shot with the IMAX camera. It's the first movie that was shot entirely in IMAX for like motion, this kind of stuff, right? And they had to build a box to muffle the sound of the IMAX camera because it's so loud, all this stuff. But one of the things he talks about is that it can only shoot 3 minutes at a time. And, this comes up of, well, like, how did that work with the actors? Don't they get really, so anyways, but that is exactly the length, right? I don't know, they keep changing it, but for a long time that was the length of like a TikTok or a IG reel or, you know, a YouTube short or whatever. It could be 90 seconds, but 3 minutes was usually kind of the longer length for a long time. And I think that's, you know, noteworthy, right? That the film, even as I was watching it last night, I was kind of like counting as I was watching certain segments. And you can see that very often it moves in these very quick ways, right? From like scene to scene. There's only a few examples where it actually would exceed that total time, but obviously that's because it's 3 minutes of this, 3 minutes of that, 3 minutes of something else in the same kind of area or whatever. But yeah, so I think that's an interesting point on the whole. Some other thing that you said, you brought up the white dude thing. There is that comment in that interview with the Chinese professor, right, where she asks him the stupid question about like, do you have to apologize for greatness nowadays? Which I do think we'll probably come back to in the analysis of this film, because it is, I think, a worthy question to sort of, I wouldn't have raised it in the way that she did, but there is something there that bothers people and sits in the discourse that I do think is somewhat interesting around this question of Odysseus is celebrated, right, within the Odyssey and within Homer's Odyssey and within Nolan's, you know, it's this guilty thing. I still think there's a weird relationship he has with the gods, which I think is, even in Nolan's, that has to be reconciled in some way and discussed, because he is favored, right? Like he is still, you know, favored even if he feels guilty in this version. But that the thing that she asked him is like, do great people have to apologize for their greatness in today's society? And he says yes, right? Which to the right wingers is like, see, you know, he's a cucked liberal. Like that's the thing that they point to, right? Of like, what, you know, and you know, to me, I'm just like, that's like, even saying like, why does he say yes to that? Like, what are you talking about? Like, you don't go around apologizing. Like, you're treated like like the way that these people roll out the red carpet. And granted, it is a universal product. Like, I noted a lot of the people who were saying like, thank you for saving our industry, which was something that people actually like, Tonight Show hosts and stuff like that. It's like, well, you work for the same company. So in a certain way, right? Like you know, you're just rooting for your own team in a certain way, on this kind of capitalist enterprise. But yeah. Anyway, I appreciated you bringing up the IG reel thing. I wanted to say that before we move on. But yeah, go ahead, Mtume.
So I did look it up. The film is 3,400 shots. Even if you were to maybe adjust it a little lower for time and say a movie is like maybe like 2-hour film, that is an insane amount of shots. It's actually above average for the standard Hollywood film. And I mean, this is a kind of a thing with like Nolan and like the filmmaking, because what happens is, and I really like that Jemma saying he has visuals, because his image systems, what we call like in film language, like they don't really have a specificity of like intent, rather than he kind of creates like a total sensory. And even in the totalizing of the sensory, it's not like Lucretia Martel where like she's giving you specific things, where things are kind of like where she'll have the camera be here, but then you'll hear the children over there. She's doing like really specific things to kind of like place your attention to the various senses. No, he just like literally is like literally shooting a big old, it's like I'm not thinking of the Boots Riley gun, you know, like it's that thing, it's that shot, that kind of thing going at you, right? The dialectical gun, right, kind of going at you is like this old big thing, and hoping that you'll be imbued, and then you'll just change and you'll be in it. And to me, it's someone who doesn't really trust himself completely, or doesn't really knows what he's doing. He has a massive, which is interesting. And like, and I'll say this is kind of always what happens with these kind of movies. But what I'll say here first is, this is kind of what you always see, is they have a massive amount of resources, so they kind of overuse them. and they just kind of say, you know, I want you to do it the most large and in charge kind of way, and let's, you know, push it out. But then, of course, these always kind of match because, you know, he clearly sees within himself a kind of Odysseus type dilemma, which is very big into these, you know, kind of first author cinema people like Nolan. They're consistently kind of going within their own subjectivity and then finding the way that the lead character can kind of like fit into that. So of course, you know, Odysseus, his whole thing was someone who had to manage massive amounts of resources in terms of humans and people and bringing them across ships and making the decisions to be in fights against people he doesn't know and so forth and so on, and his land and all this type of shit. So it becomes this, you know, circular kind of thinking that's really narcissistic, and the movies end up being that way as well, because he's in this constant thing where he's like thinking he knows what the audience needs. So like there's like this joke that I sent Jay this guy's like comedian. I don't know who the comedian was. He was making fun of him, and he would say, "What's up with Nolan has to do a cutaway for every little fucking thing? Like every like he's like the cutaway dude. Like every little thing he brings something up, cutaway, brings it up, cutaway." And like you could say he's trying to like talk to his audience and like give a kind of like making sure that they get it, or he's fundamentally knows on some level he hasn't actually created a system of images that people through their own kind of imagination would be able to come to and understand. Right? The performances are wooden. It is interesting, and I say it gives it away. If you literally watch Samantha Morton's performance, she does not get cutaways for the most part, because like you're actually watching her act and she doesn't need it. She actually has wider frames than the other actors. Like it's like they were like, oh, actually Samantha Morton's kind of dope. Let's do this shit. Like, well, like, but like Tom, like what was it? Tom Holland. Oh my gosh, when he's talking, good. I mean, dude. Side note, I haven't watched Spider-Man movies. I've only seen like him in the end. He's bad. No one told me he's this bad of an actor. He's really bad. The guy can't do shit, right? But between that, they have these wooden performances. He has to constantly do the cutaways, the music for like 2.5 hours, really kind of bombarding your senses. You know, crashings, lots of sounds. I mean, I said this to Jay, I was like, and I don't go see a lot of these movies as much as I used to, but like it was really loud. I never do this. And I was like, this is like the loudest movie that I think I've heard in years. And Jay said, and then another friend confirmed that movies seem to be getting louder. And I didn't realize that. And that's actually something very interesting to kind of chart and think about, that movies are actually fundamentally getting louder. But this was insanely loud.
It is really loud. Like I you know, so I took my son the third time. So first time first of all, it was intended to be once, and we made the smart decision not to take our 8-year-old to it, right? So that was so then I had to go with my teenager and then my partner separately, right? And then so I took him to see it on IMAX because he had seen it on standard yesterday, and it's a lot louder in IMAX, which is why I asked you to your question, because you were like, you saw it in standard, and it is significantly louder in IMAX, but it is just a loud movie. I mean, there's so much that is done through the sonic, you know, and there's a lot of, yeah. I mean, the whole thing with Odysseus's bow, you know, fitting into the music and all of this kind of stuff, you know, yeah, it's a very loud movie.
Yeah. Sorry, but I will say, within that, we have to acknowledge this is part, I think, of the Nolan ideology generally. Because if I go back to things like Batman, and this is where I think people have to be really careful, because there isn't, I think, enough conversation about what scale and the impetus and need to create large scale generally really means. And this kind of default that exists even amongst people who are supposed to be politically progressive. And I'm not saying it just in this kind of way of, oh, you're spending too much money. But what does scale mean? and this idea that everything has to be scaled in this kind of grandiose way. And then what the narrative of scale typically, and almost always, lines up with, right? Especially in a film like this, which is clearly about this civilizational question, quote unquote. And I'll leave it there.
There's so much. The cuts shocked me because I would, like, different filmmaker, but I feel like he would also think of himself as doing something like Tarkovsky. And I just happen to know this from a John Akumfer interview where he met Sven Nykvist, who shot The Sacrifice, and he's like, "Oh, there were 186 cuts in that." So for that's unbelievable. Like, I mean, obviously, and it's a pretty similar length of film. It's like 2.5 hours. The Sacrifice, obviously,
about the same, almost about the sound.
Yeah,
almost about the same length at all, completely.
Yeah, and I was like, wow, when you said like it's 10 times that, or actually more, it should be 20 times. Like, that says a lot. And I also think what you're talking about, I've seen other reviews from people I am mutuals with on Letterboxd who are like, you're lugging this camera around, which it only allows, it's funny it's also very like emblematic of so-called tech innovations, where it's like, this actually makes it harder to shoot a movie, but you have to sell it more. It's like, oh, we can only do 3 minutes. It does feel like the scale question, it feels like it is a performance of scale. And I think I want to say this is like I'm probably not going to quote it completely right, but I think maybe, Mtume, you've said this before when y'all were talking about the Imperial 80s, is like, people want to see, quote, all the product on the screen. I want to see all I paid for, all the backers. They're like, you couldn't, a lot of I alluded to, like, sort of very generally sort of 70s remakes or of antiquity, whether Antigone or something like that. And they are very Spartan. They're using the outdoor, location shooting. It's just people in costumes that are like, I suppose, actually closer to the way people dressed. I mean, you can think of all those. There are a lot of Rossellini historical films, some of which were like this one about Socrates. And like, it's just people wearing a robe and talking. Like, it's that is not going to happen. Which is also worth adding in this film. One thing that really bothered me, and he has never been able to do it, is shoot a conversation. It's actually almost impressive to be this highly financed and this highly trained eyes, because the other thing is too, we go back generations to silent film, whatever, where people didn't have film school. His excuse can't be like, well, I don't have the resources to do that or something, when I'm like, there are, film shot on no dollars that can shoot a conversation. And it feels like it's probably because it's just not important to him. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, like why some of the acting's so bad, is it's like, I kind of get the sense, and someone I follow on Letterboxd said this, and I hadn't even thought of this, is that like he just shoots a bunch of stuff and then stitches it together, which, that can sometimes work. But I think when you're doing a 3-hour movie about all these, often he has kind of a real world, or the last couple, maybe we'd consider this an era in his filmmaking, real world references, like Oppenheimer, was an actual person, and that historical period, and then the Odyssey having a text before it. It does feel like that is not going to go well, or is hard to, you're making it hard for yourself, but you're doing it maybe in kind of, to relate it to the civilizational ethos. Almost, it reminds me of having studied the Lomaxes who recorded the blues. I don't know if people know this, is where they had these tape recorders they'd bring out to like black prisons, workhouses, plantations, or recently plantations in the South, indigenous reservations, which we can also talk about this Western Sahara part too. And a lot of the romance of it was like, they're lugging this giant tape recording equipment, which in the 1930s and 1930s and 30s and even 40s and 50s is huge, just like computers were huge back in the day. Like, and so it's like, oh, how did they even do this? Well, we went out there and we recorded this thing. And it kind of is an affirmation of the piece of technology, even though the technology in this case, it seems like makes it harder to shoot a film. And then, so I think that just feels like a particularly absurd part of this endeavor. And then the other part about it, we could maybe go into eventually, like widescreen formats and the kind of fetish for widescreen formats, which also happens around the same time these kind of historical films become really popular in Hollywood. The peplum, films about ancient Egypt, films about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, So I was going to respond to another thing, but it's escaping me. But yeah, I think that speaks to him not really wanting to stage any of these things. There's a very antagonistic relationship to theater in his films. He doesn't. I think he would have to give up control, and it also doesn't seem like something you want to do. And I think if you're a filmmaker, you also get more control if you just. There's also a bad Tarkovsky impression in this too, as well as other things. Is like Mirror? Tarkovsky shot and didn't tell anyone what it was going to be, and then kind of stitched it together in post. And so there is, and you could say there's like an appropriation of a Soviet Vertov ethos in that too, oh, I'm just getting a bunch of coverage, which is a lot of also what his films kind of look like, and then stitching it together. And I'm not going to give anyone else, including the actors, kind of purchase on the meaning of the project. It doesn't necessarily feel particularly collaborative. And the last thing I'll say is there's a famous interview with Leonardo DiCaprio where someone asked him, and he's like, "Oh, I don't know what that Inception was about." I'm sure you all have seen this because it was really big, like 10 years ago or a few years ago. And it's it's okay if whatever. I mean, well, I wouldn't want to be in a movie where people don't have any ideological whatever with me. That's just me. But I think it's pretty funny that there was this. He was just like, "No, even after seeing it, I don't know what it's about. Oh, only Chris knows what it's about," or referring to Christopher Nolan. And I think there is like a fantasy of mastery stuff going on with a lot of this, that you're like, it's a reason why people are talking about him as the figure to save Hollywood, save filmmaking. It's very much wrapped up in that. When you're making a film that way, you're kind of inviting that, it's not, anyway, so I'll end that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all that. I mean, so where I wanted to go next, and just to give folks an idea of like what we're going to do in this conversation, we will get into spoilers, I'm sure, because we're going to be talking next about kind of the political ideology and, the politics, the ideology of the film. Because I think, honestly, this is where I've seen the least amount of criticism. I've seen a lot of people fascinated with, this is not historical, which I'm like, it's a myth. Like, what are you talking about? And then I see people, and I also agree with the point you made up front, Jemma, which is that a movie is a movie. You know what I mean? And I know, Mtume, you've talked about this too. Like, you are speaking to the current audience when you're making a movie. Like, you're not speaking to people 3,000 years ago. That's not who you're in conversation with, right? So it doesn't make sense for you to just replicate, something that was put together through a historical process that's still not well understood, to be honest with you, in terms of Homer's The Odyssey, right? Because it is also just pulling together all of these kind of oral traditions into written word for the first time by probably multiple people, many, many years after it was actually kind of first conceived. But there's all of this discourse that we've talked about, and there's very little discussion of the politics of the film beyond a very clunky, like, is he a Republican? Is he a liberal discourse? Which is really the way I would, right? The Republicans are like, he doesn't hang all the women slaves in the end, so he's not a real Republican. And and Zendaya, I mean, I will show, actually, because I did find this IG real funny. One little, we'll break in to a little Josh Johnson real quick. All right, hang on.
Mad when they saw that. Some people were so mad when they saw the Odyssey, where they were like, "What? Black people?" What? But the black people are in the movie too. That's not fair. Black people weren't even invented yet. How are they in the movie? It's not right. No, this is great. No, this is very funny. Sometimes like racism comes out and it annoys me or it makes me concerned, but this one was very funny. This one, it's like, you can't make her black? What? No. If they would just come out and be like, hey, listen to me. I have nothing. I have nothing, all right? Which is why I need everybody in the Odyssey to be white. I have nothing. And even though this won't bring any material difference to my life, it's all I need to get by. If they would just say that, I'd be fine. I'd be like, oh, wow, I didn't know you were struggling there, but it's the fact that they come out and they're like, what, black? Nobody was madder than Elon Musk. Oh, he was furious. Elon Musk was like, how could they do this? Billionaire, by the way. How can they do this?
Anyway, maybe not that funny, but I just found the Elon Musk was really the part that I wanted to get to, right? Which is just sort of that the people that are having that reaction the most, you know, like this idea that they have nothing is actually kind of ridiculous. But yeah. So what were you going to say, Mtume?
Well, I think the investment is always kind of the interesting thing to me on all levels. But I think the most important is to go into what is Nolan's investment in it. And this is where, so when I'm watching the film and I'm getting these kind of questions of civilization and I'm always thinking about where people are painting things, and you're thinking about where Nolan has always done these things, like Morgan Freeman's character, specifically in the Batman films, I always thought was very interesting, right? You know, this kind of, we talked about, I think we talked about with what movie where like, yeah, even like Paul Winfield in like, you know, Terminator yesterday, right? You know, like you have the black man in these particular positions of guidance, right? Within the project, kind of, you know, saying, well, we can do this, right? You know, Nolan does not have an interest in capitulating to a particular kind of like far right, quote unquote, or what he would see as maybe like overly demonstrative way of looking at civilization. He thinks he's above that. You can see that in his kind of like faux intellectualism. He'll do it in there. So in a way, I feel like he thinks he needs to discipline them as well. I think like him having Elliot Page up there very quickly, I do think is him saying that I need to discipline you into understanding and how the civilization. And this is this kind of the interliberal, and I say classical liberal, classical Western white supremacist kind of thinking. It's kind of how they argue. I'm like watching 3 hours of kind of how they argue about civilization, right? It's like if you had Locke and Hobbes in a room, we're gonna argue about this shit right now. That's kind of what I'm getting, right? And Nolan's whole thing is, yeah, we got to sprinkle them in, right? And it's but also kind of how Hollywood works. Like a lot of people haven't had this vantage point. You know, I've had it in my life when you sit there and you hear a couple of white film executive or like agents talk about actors of color and why they like them. All the liberal racism comes out and they don't even realize it. Oh, they're just such, you know, they have an energy and they really represent the craft well. They're really important to Hollywood. I mean, they're letting it all out. And you're just seeing kind of Nolan do that. Like, you know, he was sitting there going, Lupita, yes, let's put her here. Helen of Clytemnestra, and she'll kill Agamemnon. And it's like, it's all these chess pieces, but he has a deep investment because because at the end of the day, there is this kind of certain idea of civilization from a certain kind of way within liberalism that feels a need to kind of place people in particular ways around Matt Damon, Tom Holland, and Anne Hathaway, right? I mean, that's like the key, like kind of triangular nexus that kind of exists there, right? And Charlize Theron, which is always just odd to me. She's such an odd career. I mean,
that's an African actress right there.
Yep.
You need to
who recently said some shit. Did you hear what she said recently?
No, I know.
Did you see that shit she said recently?
Like,
yeah. I was terrified at these people fighting for their rights in South Africa. I was like, oh,
Charlize said in like the 80s or something.
I was like, wait a minute, hold up, this is fake. I was like, wow, Charlize, tell them how you really feel, right? It was deep. But yeah, you're just seeing it. And like, it's cheap to me. And this is where like any kind of investment in it just shows you, I just think the ideological chaos of this nation. But I think this is where Nolan is the most of a provocateur in his most kind of lazy way. He knows what he's doing in this kind of way. He knows it'll sell tickets, it'll get discourse, it'll get a chaotic amount of people to be for him. He probably knows capitulating to like a far right thing. I think he also, I will say, he didn't like that people called him far right for the last Dark Knight.
Yeah,
he was really like offended by it, and I think those things kind of stick in his head when he's working.
Yeah, and where I wanted to go, I mean, I think that clip just shows kind of a lot of how the discourse has circulated online, which is you do have these right wingers who are like going way just like, whoa, bro, like what, like you don't want what, like, or you want to see these women all hung at the end or like whatever, right? But then you do have a lot of people who are celebrating it just merely, or maybe just laughing also at the crash outs of some of the right wingers, which is what he's basically doing, right? Of like the diversity of the film, right? Which again, I think to your point, Mtume, like none of the people of color, unless we want to make a strong case for John Leguizamo as a POC. I don't know how invested people are in that discussion. But like none of the people of color within the film, I think, have very important or like central roles. And I mean, even he is kind of like a minor character. He just he's a really good performance, I think, in the film myself, of among the films with the people within the film. But
he is the colored butler, though. I hate to say it. He's the colored butler.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's an enslaved person in the film, and one that loves his master, right? Like very much like is dutiful after 20 years of his master being gone, right? Yeah, so the political ideology to me, and I mean, what made me come back to it is what you said about the last Dark Knight film, because I think there's actually a lot in common between the Bane Dark Knight film, Dark Knight Rises or whatever it's called, and this film in terms of the politics of it. And I mean, I guess what I'll do is I'll name some of the things that I think are really important to the ideological work that he's doing here, and we can talk about them. So one is this concept of Xenia, or Zeus's law, as it is conveyed in the film. And it's correctly in the film identified as basically you respect your guests, you feed them, you provide some basic level of hospitality to them, regardless of what you think their lot in life is. But the reason is because they might be a god, right? The reason is that and it fits very well, I think, with what you're talking about too, Mtume, in terms of this diversification or assimilationist aesthetic, right? Is that like you're thinking about the good immigrant, right? And you don't want to necessarily turn away the immigrant or the homeless person or just shun them totally, right? Because they might be a gem. And so then it becomes also a requirement of this is a certain way of being the recipient of this kind of and a kind of reciprocity, right? Which is violated by the suitors, right? So the suitors take advantage of this idea of Zeus's law to be in the house for years, eating up all the food and drinking all the wine. And I think this is the where you start to get there's other elements, because I think the Trojan horse and the war itself and how that's dealt with in the film is something that we need to delve into as well. But with this concept of the suitors, like you also have a very conservative notion, in my view, of this kind of hospitality or immigration, which is that there are all of these people who are just going to take advantage, right, of this hospitality, of this civilization, of this culture, of all that it offers, and they have to be killed, right? Like that's the where the movie goes, right? And so I think that that's the piece again of, and Nolan has always been very comfortable with this like fascistic violence, and it wasn't just like that Bane was this misrepresentation of Occupy, right? But it was also that you want a billionaire who, develops technology to go beat the crap out of people. Like this is um, and so those are some of the things I think that the concept of Zeus's law and Xenia as it is in the film. And then also, if we want to talk about the Trojan horse and Troy and that element of it too, because that obviously becomes this heavy weight of guilt for Odysseus in Nolan's Odyssey, right? Which was not something that existed within the Homer version. But I don't think the fact that it doesn't exist in Homer's version doesn't really matter, other than it kind of cues us that Nolan's talking about something that he wants to talk about there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of more jump off of what was just said, but also what you all said is that looking at this sort of genre of film in classic Hollywood, it really does give you a very specific trajectory of sort of the neoliberal arc of Hollywood, in that, in a lot of these films like Land of the Pharaohs or any of the kind of peplum films from this period, if there is a representation to the casting argument and around all these arguments of like there are people of people of color, quote unquote, black actors, but they're always in the background, right? And that very much in the conventional way we'd speak of diversity and neoliberalism, right? Is like in this version they're in the foreground. I mean, there really isn't a foreground in his films, which I think goes back to the visual language, which is also an interesting way to think about it. I think the other thing we're talking about too is like the way he shoots a film too is like, and also the way he's kind of swooping everything up in what you're saying is that if he had traditional geometry in his films, I think he might have to power would be more overt, potentially. Like you would see more, like this person's on a throne. A lot of the 50s films were very, partially because they were derived from theater, but also because they, I don't think cared about this concern. They weren't like, oh, I have to look at how I depict this black actor. I mean, beyond certain things, maybe by the 50s, it would have been a little taboo, although there's tons of brown face and some maybe blackface in these films, is that they would have had these, they had these kind of power dynamics very visibilized very clearly. And it is another way to talk what you're bringing up around the suitors and things, which is not how. I also watched there's a 1968 Rossi version. That's an Italian filmmaker that was on, it was on Italian television, which became really big in the late 60s. I mentioned the Rossellini films, go on to that, and Italian TV becomes very big. And what's interesting in that version is Odysseus is kind of terrible. Which I think is closer to the book. He's much more like vengeful. His, they all have to be killed argument is much more chauvinistic. I mean, I'm going to sound like the person, but it's not something you watch and go, oh, he has the moral right. It also, none of the versions I saw there's also the Kirk Douglas one for the 50s, which you sent me the article that talks about it. And I don't super see this in that version either. There's a lot of attempt, which Nolan is not able to do dramatically or character wise, but that it's like a romantic love between Penelope and Odysseus. And that is really not, I can't remember in the book, you could speak to this, but it's not really present in any of the other much earlier filmic adaptations from the 50s and 60s. And so it's kind of interesting to see that so centrally, I think it's a bigger thing we could talk about too, is that in a way, maybe kind of paralleling Spielberg, because I think that he also uses love in Interstellar too. Like it's like, oh, science works all these ways, but love goes across the galaxy. It's very Spielbergian. It also is funny because you're like, he is this very, mansplaining like movie maker, but they don't make sense. Like it's like, oh, this is the way time works, and y'all don't understand. You can picture getting a lecture where he's like using a sugar cube in a cafe, and you're like, no, that's not it. You brought this up about the ex who is a scientist who did. So it is funny to see all these arguments, and then it's kind of very similar to Spielberg, but it's much more denuded because I don't think he's just able to do it as well as, not that I don't like Spielberg's movies, but like I think there's a generic kind of sentimentality that Spielberg is able to appeal to, maybe having grown up with that being so pervasive in films too. That what's really strange is how romantic love is kind of the arc in a way that's used to justify a lot of this, that is not present in the other cinematic adaptations of the Odyssey. In the Italian one, which is actually I think the best one in '68, it's on YouTube, it's free, it has subtitles if people want to watch it. Odysseus, it kind of switches up where you're like maybe a little identifying with him, to the ending where you're like, oh, he's like gone off the, like he's like, how dare y'all step in my house? And not even as like a moral, it's more like what he's cheered on for is like, oh, he took his home back. You know, like that's real, you know, like respect. That's what a man do. Like, it's not wrapped up in the romantic love for Penelope. And in fact, there's a really interesting shot in the Italian one where Odysseus shoots one of the suitors, and his scream echoes throughout the building. And Irene Papas, who's an amazing actress, who's Greek, plays Penelope, and it cuts to her, and you can still hear the scream echoing, and she's terrified. She's like, oh my God, this is, you know, it's actually like a kind of like, I mean, there's like almost domestic violence, like allusions. It's very interesting. And you're like, oh, this is a much more, and so it's interesting to think about with the suitors here is that they're also kind of humanized. I don't know the dude's name, and he could be totally a nice person, but from The Walking Dead, who was one of the kind of the most evil suitor in this, which I thought was just, why even make him a character at that point? It was really hard for me to like sit with that character because he was so inscrutably like, I'm going to kick the dog, which feels like, you know, what you're doing in a film when you have someone mean to an animal, especially, you know, that you're kind of making them irredeemable in a way that again, it's to a lot of what y'all talked about with the Imperial. It's just a very lazy writing, and it's very, it gives away the game too. I'm like, oh, you really want us to hate these people? You have Robert Pattinson almost doing a Joker impression. We don't have to talk about my view of his acting. And that trend in general of the actor capital, all capitals, because I was often yelling the lines, kind of a Mickey 17 character, still playing them. But I think it strikes me that how in the other versions, the suitors are not really, it says something about the humanization and like how humanization carries that violent, you know, thinking like this idea Hartman, these other people who critiques, Sylvia Wynter, is like, it's weird how the humanization, or even kind of representation, we could use the word, because there's a certain relationship between them, actually makes them more hateable, you know, and like deserving of violence cinematically. Whereas in a lot of like I said, the Italian one, it actually uses that scene, the killing of the suitors, to be like, whoa, Odysseus is like as an audience member, I was like, oh, he's like, this kind of, I don't know how I feel about this guy, or this is fucked up, or there's much more terrifying, I'll just say, you know, like, whereas in this, it's much more like, yes, Batman's home, and now he, you know, like he went on the Batman journey where Bane was winning, and now he's back and his back healed, or, you know, it's very much along that kind of he went to the masseuse finally. he's doing Pilates, like, but yeah, it is very like, it is so much more racist in this than it is. I mean, the other one, it doesn't have, you know, I mean, there is supposed to be difference in the Odyssey. It's worth, you know, like kind of like you were alluding to, like class and other. And he also, in the Italian one, he also threatens, which I think is in the book, he threatens his, Odysseus threatens his servant who's about to like, you know, out him, or who's washing his feet. We have that same scene. And I think it's much more benign here in a way where he's like, oh, don't tell her yet. Like he's Santa Claus, like winking, like someone pulled on his beard. Whereas in the original, it's like way more terrifying. He's like, you tell someone, I think in the Italian one, it's like, he's like, you tell someone and the suitors won't be the only one I'll kill. Or so it's like some line where it's like, whoa, this came, and it precedes that scene. So it's funny how the diversity works. Like you're saying, he gives these lines to these token characters in a way to either, you know, mystical Negro them out of existence, kind of with Zendaya, which I think is what's going on, because you're like, oh, she's just this sage character, you know, kind of Morgan Freeman like. I mean, I could not. Or they're like, I mean, you could maybe even argue the friend who's South Asian, I'm sorry, I never remember the names of the characters, the actors. You could kind of argue they have this sort of, which I know is that one lady's argument, the plucky sidekick thing, which I don't entirely disagree with. And then the inscrutably evil black suitor, you're like, obviously there's no complexity there. No one's like, oh, they're like, this is just an evil man. I can't wait till he gets killed. We're obviously waiting for it, especially when it's mean to the dog, to Spider-Man. And it's like, it feels like that is actually what it kind of reins in, like you were saying, to maybe both those sides of this, where he's like, well, I think, I like right wing, wink, wink, I do know what you're talking about. Like, these people are invading our home and they can move here, but they better follow the rules. Y'all better watch out. Like, you use too many resources, because of course immigrants get everything, like this fantasy that they're the ones draining welfare systems and things like that, or whatever. It's so, to use a common show word, nefarious. So
yeah, I mean, so in that interview that Nolan did, and people have talked about it a little bit in the chat with the I forget her name, the Chinese scholar. I think is she a literary scholar? I'm not exactly sure. She
Hannah
also
Arendt.
And Ayn
Yeah.
Rand. Ayn Rand.
Oh,
Yeah.
the duo, exactly. There's this moment in the interview where they talk about the criticisms of the film and the criticisms of form. And Nolan says something that I think is very telling in it, where he says, I don't have the direct quote, but he talks about like that film has developed what he calls a universal language. So he's seeing this kind of conceptualization that film language has a universal. But of course, someone like him would never, ever, ever even think about, is it an imposed language? Is Hollywood an imposed kind of way that we interpret things? So kind of going back to your point, Jim, about like the whole love thing, he has a relationship to these tropes, these kinds of things that he always has to kind of circle back and use, because he sees them as like traditional or value neutral, but thus also value, highest things that you have to attach to with Hollywood. But then that gets very interesting, kind of going back to what you've both been pointing out, particularly with the suitors, because then what gets interesting to me is if we think about the social relations of this, and this is where the Marxist part of me just comes out, I'm watching it going, well, this is a socially produced relationship. Of course they need this. How the fuck else they going to get out of their social position, right? And and that's where my brain is. And of course, but like you're saying, you're watching this like, nah, man, do not try to fuck with Odysseus, who is top of the food chain. You will get jacked up, right? Do not fuck with his son. Even if you are better than him, he's his son, the divine right thing. And what's interesting is we got no king's protests, all these people, we don't like feudalism, fuck kings. But we fuck with Odysseus. We fuck with the dude taking. We'll take that queen. We'll take Anne Hathaway as queen. We got Spider-Man we got Spider-Man as the crown prince. Who's gonna save civilization as they go off into the boats, into the seas, and do some other shit. Find other civilizations and fuck them up on the side, right? Like it's so chaotic, but there's a way that it's telling what Nolan is talking about. It's like this acceptance of the universal language, right? There's this acceptance of this universal language that we have. And when these ideas are put into that form, we go, okay, well, that's fine, right? We'll accept it, right? Unless it's like a blatant thing, like, a certain, racist representation that we can really throw it out there. So it's like the scale of judgment is like very low. Like the bar is very, 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 very low completely. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I mean, there's definitely more, and then we can go to other things.
So, do y'all want me to read some lines?
Please,
From
probably
the movie,
read them
you had
better
the
than some of
script.
those actors, man.
Well, I don't know
Tom
about
Holland
that.
was remarkably bad. It was, yeah.
He was but like part of it, I thought that was an interesting choice, because I didn't actually look this up. Are they directly from Emily Wilson's text? A lot of the lines?
No, not at all.
So he
Not at all.
rewrote them.
So like one of the so I think that's an important thing just to say is like there's really nothing in the film that is drawn from any translation of the Odyssey. I mean, like,
Interesting.
there's like, of course, in terms of like things that happen within the movie, yes, right? Like but even, I mean, it's all adaptation and interpretation, right? Which is fine with me, in the sense that, like, he's like, okay, this is what I'm going to make the Cyclops scene look like and how I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to do his interaction with Cersei. And there's no validity really with any of those necessarily to what happens in the text. Like, the Cersei scene is totally different from anything that's in any version of the Odyssey, right? But like, there's like a series of events that also happen within the Odyssey, basically, in a lot of ways. But the dialogue is totally different, which Emily Wilson actually does say in her review, which is a very funny review because she like trashes the whole thing and then like says thank you to him at the end because he's going to help her sell more books and save literacy also, right? This is the other thing that she says, is that not only is he saving film, he's saving literacy because people are now buying the Odyssey. Which I will say
Very
is also
Christ-like.
To what you said,
Sacrificed himself.
to what you said, Jemma, though, the points you're raising, I think, are really important because the right is correct in that our moral codes today are completely different than the moral codes were within the original Odyssey, right? And so any sense of what Odysseus should do, right, especially in this film, it is much more modern. And if you read the play, like, you look at it and you think it's terrible. And there is that moment where Anne Hathaway like talks about, well, there's the moment where they throw the puppies off the cliff and this bothered like some people. And it's like, this is so benign compared to a lot of the shit that happens in the Odyssey, right? But there was also the thing that Anne Hathaway says about when Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter, right? She's like, that's monstrous, right? And of course, that wouldn't have been like, I mean, obviously it is, right? We can say that as modern folks, but like, that's not the way it was thought of within, Greek culture. It was thought of as a very significant sacrifice, right? In the same way that there's biblical sacrifices like this, right? But it's even prior to the Bible, right? So it is a morality that precedes it. And I think that's the other thing, is there's been a discussion about him Judeo-Christianizing the Odyssey. And I think that's true to a certain extent in terms of the moral codes that he's imposing upon it. But yeah, I mean, you all probably have more. I forgot the other thing. I mean, we could go to Troy unless you all have other things to say about.
You said you had lines you were going to read. That's what.
I'll read the lines.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just say one
really
quick thing.
Go ahead.
I do think it is interesting, his need though to kind of make presentational language. I found that like that was where he felt he needed to kind of hold a kind of traditional or old school kind of vibe, is in this like traditional language that none of his actors really had the ability to even kind of like fake. It also is the writing is just not very good, right? It's like faux. It's faux Shakespeare and or faux Greek drama, faux Sophocles or something like that, and that kind of vibe where he's going for it. But I did find that very interesting because I was like, I'm like, bro, you really go with this for 2.5 hours. Good job.
But he goes back and forth to stuff like fuck this. Like, it's like it blends a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, because some of the actors, I mean, like Robert Pattinson, he's such he's a Twilight dude, like he can't really do anything past his kind of. What's funny, Gemma, I want to say, he's actually gotten slightly better than what he used to be.
Yeah. Totally. So I thought this was like his best performance because bad. I hated him. Like,
but he's got slightly better.
I have this whole thing, which is this is way beyond the purview of this kind, but of like how theatrical acting has been appropriated to film, not to have theater in film, which it still feels very allergic to, but to have the actor take the public of theater into his pocket. It's very Daniel Day-Lewis. I just can't, which is very much in the I can't stand. Like, and so that's more my beef with Pattinson and Emma Stone. This just kind of trajectory, you know, where I'm like, okay, they're showing up to just while out, you know, like it kind of reminds me of like Jim Carrey back in the day where, but you know, it made more sense. I mean, which he's not like he was a bad, I mean, he, you know, I think comedy is the hardest acting to do. I think it was Anthony Hopkins who said something like that. Like, I think there's truth to that. It's just something I find a little like the capital A acting, because it feels like movies hate theater so much now and have like in a bunch of different movie theaters become very conservative too, like that you've talked about. It just, that's where I have issues with Pattinson more. So not that like, and it's not, but it does feel like he's trying, and I think it also speaks to the film where it's like during the suitor scene, he's like, get them. Then he's like yelling and like gesticulating, and you're like, where did this energy come from? Because it's never in the movie. Because we should also talk about that too with the acting. It's a lot of what we're talking about too has to do with this kind of like dour affect that Nolan, the seriousness, I would say capital S, serious. And this, and people's, it's very much like, I don't know what you want to say that, like the kind of Coolishams effect or something that like people are like, oh, he's very serious, therefore this movie must be serious, you know, like as if we're cutting to an image of a serious brooding person, therefore this, everything going on must be, whoa, like everyone in the film is frowning, which feels very not contemporary or ancient Greece or any, you know, like not very Mediterranean, whatever, like culturally or something. Like I also hate that about it, that it just feels, which also feels very anti-theatrical, like to theater. Like I just am like, I don't know. I mean, there probably are plays where literally everyone is like brooding, like Batman. But I do think that is something I find really hard to deal with, because it is a faux seriousness. I think you said something else, maybe like faux writing or faux drama. And it feels like it attains its authority from gravitas that's unearned. And it's just like, oh, wow, he's talking with a husky voice. I guess it's, you know, and it's also very gendered too. It makes sense why it's harder for him to have women in it, because I'm like, I don't know what the equivalent, I guess a crying woman would, which is also the women in this, like what's her name, was Agamemnon's wife, and then kind of Zendaya's weepy the whole time, and then Anne Hathaway's big monologue is her kind of, you know, crying and losing it. It feels very like, I'm like, is there no, like, no one told a joke in this movie? This is 3 hours. This is just, I'm like, I don't know what world you want me to believe this is. But the last thing I'll say, which is why I really just say sorry, is like, reading the line, is that there's this, I wanted to quote it, but I'll just summarize it. Is there's this like Bruno Latour line where he's like, the modern knows, but everyone he meets believes. I'm paraphrasing it. And I do think that's very much Nolan, where he's like, oh, that's very cute. You all have your beliefs. You know, you're probably what a liberal would say, biases, you know, but I know, you know, like, and it kind of comes off, a lot of his work comes off that way. And I think it's very much relates to the right left discourse of the film, is that it's, and what we were talking about originally about the ambiguity is it's like, oh, isn't it cute the way these people are debating that, you know, again, it affirms this sort of sense of mastery that he refuses to have like a meaningful conversation about or something, that is like, oh, I know, but it's cute, these little believers, these little discourse engines around, you know, the world, that they have their beliefs, but I'm the true modern, you know, like to your saying, updating the text. I think that's one of the biggest modernizing of it, is it, he who obviously is kind of implanted into Odysseus is never a believer. You know, he's not as naive in the way that, you know, Nolan doesn't see himself as naive. He sees himself as kind of like knowing, and the rest of us guessing, and oh, that's cute little beliefs you brought to the movie and stuff. So
Absolutely. I mean, I think his description, you know, like when in the film, I'll read the lines in a second, folks. I just want to say this first. But Cersei, right? She describes herself, right, as someone who reveals truths, right? So she doesn't have, he asks her something of like, can you whatever, like predict the future or something like that, but she's like basically like, no, I can see the truth. And that's what Nolan thinks of himself, right? He thinks that everybody, like, that there's all these other views and opinions and people have ways that they look at, but he's the knower, and his ability as a storyteller, right, is to tell you what is true. And I think that is where he takes this idea. One of you talked about, I think Mtume, you talked about not assigning value to techniques and stuff like that. But he likes to at least pretend, I think this is largely pretense, that he's not assigning value or morality even to the truths that he tells. He is just showing them, right? And then this becomes his kind of, I think this is how people argue incorrectly, in my view, that his films aren't fascistic, right? Because they would argue he's just showing the fascism. He's not like saying the fascism is good, right? And I'm like, yeah, but the fascist kind of always wins. Like, so, and maybe he's arguing that's just the way it is, that the fascists always win. But like that's where it comes through, and that's how he kind of gets into that. But let me read this. So this is where it's his speech upon his return to Penelope, right? And at this point he is still which is wild. He's pretending that he's not himself, right? So he's been greeted as a guest, right? He's in rags and so on and so forth. He comes in, he's around the suitors, but he's pretending to basically be a beggar, right? But he knows that Penelope will, abide by Zeus's law and let him in and talk to him and this kind of thing. So she says something about the Odysseus that I knew would find a way to get back to me, right? It's been 20 years, folks, that this dude has been gone, we're saying, right? And another line that the right really hates is Penelope talking about her 20 years of experience not being valid enough for her to be the king, but that's a whole different, we'll put that away, park that for a minute. But so I don't know, I can't go deep enough for Chris Nolan. I'm not able to do the Christian Bale Batman voice that Matt Damon tries to do in this film, right? What if the Odysseus you knew lost his way? What if one night in a strange city he saw things that made him think the home he knew couldn't possibly be there anymore? What if, yeah, you need the music. I need like the song of the sirens in the background.
Blaring music.
Cutaways as he's speaking. No camera can just have an actor act. There's just cutaways the whole fucking time.
What if, when he left the belly of the horse and opened the gates of Troy, he saw 10 years of rage pour into that city in one night? We left them a gift, an offering of peace that they took into their home. We violated all that's ever sacred between people. It turned a fight into a hunt. To burn the walls of Troy was to burn the world entire. I think he says the entire world, but somebody put it that way, including his home. What if he knew that very night, as he walked through the fires, anarchy, and pain, and in a days of sweaty celebrations that follow, what if he knew exactly what he'd done, Penelope? What you all had done. One man's idea, one man's trick to break Zeus's law forever. We lived in a world of palaces and trade, language, blind to its beauty until we broke it. Penelope. You are the people of the sea. Yes, my queen. The breaking of Zeus's law, spreading like plague, our age of bronze collapsing, and maybe we couldn't bear to see the ruins of what he'd done, anywhere, least of all, his home. End scene.
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, this is the ideology of the film, I think, in a nutshell. And for folks who don't catch all of that, like, so the basic thing is that in this version, which is true in all of them, although there is a funny thing I happened upon, that like Trojan horse might just be a mistranslation. That Trojan horse may have just been like the Trojan word for like our tank, basically, right? And so the whole idea of it being a gift and all this other stuff was just like imposed by subsequent generations of people who didn't know what they were looking at and reading and understanding. But nonetheless, right, within the understanding of the Trojan horse, which in this version doesn't have wheels and includes a bunch of men shitting and pissing all over themselves and somehow so dumb that they bury it right by the tide rather than like 10 feet to the left so that they wouldn't, so a few of them have to drown just for the purposes of it. And Elliot Page has to be shot against it and killed and all of this. But that because it's a gift, right? And it's let into their house, right? That this is a violation of Zeus's law because of course they're going to accept a gift and they violate that by letting people in, right? And then when they let people in, they totally rape, pillage, sack, kill all the women and children, you know, all of it. And obviously this is one point of difference with the texts is that in the texts, it's Paris who had violated Zeus's law, right? So Paris, by stealing Helen, right, was the violation of Zeus's law that gave the enactment for the war. Whereas in this version, it's because Agamemnon wants trade routes and, you know, he's using his brother's wife being stolen as the justification or whatever. But it's this discourse around war crimes, around, you know, this collapsing rules-based order civilization. I think Vijay Prashad actually is although there's some pieces in his piece that I disagree with, like, or I don't think he goes quite far enough. I do think he gets to a crux of kind of Nolan's argument here, which is that we've broken the rules-based order, and this is kind of a film about that. But yeah, so anyways, go ahead, either one of you.
We've broken. There's other part of me that also finds this also to be possibly futuristic in Nolan's, that we're going to have to break the order too, right? Like if you think about it with let's get into our current events and where we are with Iran, what's constantly being stoked with China, that this idea that we're going to have a Troy, and then we're going to reach that point. And then from that point, we will then have to go through a kind of struggle of self, Western civilization. And then from that, Western civilization will then it'll find its Telemachus. And in this crisis of leadership, which I do think he's big into in leadership in crisis, because he's into Hollywood filmmaking, the great individual, the great person, the great hero, and all the kind of steps that hero must go through. He's like almost like showing us the pathway of what's going to happen. So like there's a way you could watch this movie, I think, and like say you're going to go to a war, it'll be ugly, but have confidence on the other end, the goodness will come out and this civilization that's in crisis will be okay. So like there's like, it's like I feel like you can go both ways, and I mean, and both are equally as fucking ugly, right? And as because he does have, I mean, this is where I do think he's like some fundamentally like Heideggerian in that way. He has like an ideology of war. He has this way that he really thinks about that things have to be litigated in all of his movies through these kinds of like brutal struggles of men, right? And he's willing to do a kind of like with like the Anne Hathaway line. It's so stuck out. Her little, oh my God, I've been 20 years, you know, I'm like, oh God, this was coming. All right, good job, right? He's willing to kind of do that in order to kind of show the kind of fault hands and say, hey, if you sit with us and get past this part, maybe we can figure that out on the other end. But we got to get through this shit first. And we got to, you know, cleanse from the suitors and deal with the sea people and all that type of shit first. But, you know, maybe on the other end, we can have that conversation about why you have not been queen. Just, you know, sit with us for a little bit.
Nolan says, I voted for Penelope in 2024. I think, you know, and it's also, I do think this reading a few people have brought up in terms of the modernizing or Christianizing is right, is that it is a very guilt-laden subject. And it's like, and of course, guilt is a very selfish emotion, right? It's about self-preservation, you know, white guilt. Like, it's like, you know, is about preserving white people and being, you know, it's like the white fragility thing or whatever, that kind of, cottage industry of like counseling white people about racism kind of stuff, you know, which is like, there is definitely, I think there is very much to Mtume's point too about like, oh, we're gonna have to do more fucked up stuff in the future, and so that we have to kind of arm ourselves in a different way, which is very much his film too, right? His I mean, that's very much what cinema is, arguably. I mean, it's the one weapon that no other country has been able to produce, weirdly. The Hollywood, I mean, like it's just like nothing has. I mean, it's quite fascinating, right? Like, and y'all always in the Imperial 80s kind of are talking about this too, and it's like even as we're in a moment where other forms of warfare have more or less been, like become kind of like there's a lot more parity between other countries and what the US can do. Obviously, they're finding that out with Iran and even smaller resistance forces. You can go back to Vietnam, the Korean War to some extent. But I think what is interesting about Hollywood and kind of why people are like the Save Hollywood thing is like that seems to be the one thing either people can't or aren't quite interested in, but I guess haven't could be the word, like haven't recreated like, as much resources as other countries have put, especially in the 50s, put towards film. None of them could duplicate Hollywood, even though they were kind of, if you want to look at it like an arms race of sorts and an ideological arms race, I guess. But like no one has been able, but of course other things too, because of course what goes into film production. But it is an interesting thing that is when we had to the earlier part too about the saving film or art, I think it, and how it always is really like saving Hollywood, the sort of guilt is a relationship to that. It's like, oh, how do we, and I think of the whole film being that too, because it's like, obviously he's reacting to like a very conventionally racist, if you will, Hollywood history of representing non-white people. So it's like, oh, see, but and there's also this line, there's a, I think monologue, I think it's a voiceover, which I mean, some voiceovers can be great. I don't have a rule, but this is, it's just, again, the constant montage. And it's very much like Batman, like where the montage is unfolding and it's like, we're going to start again. Da, 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 da. Again, and it's like guys training or something. And this is like, this is too much. I can't with this form, but and how they were going to build a new world, top spinning. I'm like, it's just too form. I mean, there's so much we could go more into the form of this too, which I think also gives the game away around this. But Odysseus does say something to the effect of we have to, like paraphrasing, obviously, like we have to include these marginals, so it is also about like, how do we keep this project going? Obviously, and other people pointed this out. How do we keep this Western civilization going? And his answer, I mean, he's like a pretty, I think kind of the pinnacle of neoliberalism, but something like that in Hollywood with this, like just in terms of his like sort of weird marketist ideology in a lot of his films, but which makes sense. How else would you get to the top? But I do think there is very much this sensibility that like guilt, because it is something that can be managed by film, like arguably that's what, that's that empathy machine argument, like from, I don't know if that's Ebert or Capra, or maybe it's Ebert talking about Capra. I think in a way that is like a confessional around that, because it's like, oh, how are we going to keep Hollywood relevant? Especially, it's kind of interesting. You think of a moment when younger people in particular are watching other stuff. Like I'll meet younger people who watch like Korean movies and Japanese movies almost exclusively. And I'm like, and they don't even necessarily pay attention to what comes out of, mainstream Hollywood, which is very similar to music. And I think it is like, oh, well, guilt will preserve the ideological force and project of Hollywood as it kind of like tackles these new atrocities that it has to make films about, which is, again, going back to the Imperial 80s, like very much central to its engine. So I do think, I absolutely agree that it is like, keep paralleling the militarism. Like, how do we, like, we had to break the law, but now that it's broken, like, or like, we're going to have to reevaluate some of the things we can do. So there is that self-preservation ethos, I think, which is worth mentioning too, about all of this, preserving the quote unquote West, preserving civilization, preserving Hollywood as this feeling machine, this production of, which he's very machine-like. We could also talk about this too with Nolan. He's like the mechanical filmmaker. We'll stop there, but.
Yeah, and to add to Gemma's point about the form kind of giving it away, because so like the first, how long does the Telemachus part at the beginning? 30 minutes, you would say, roughly? I mean,
and it's a significant part of the book too, as well. Just to like, I was curious about that, but as I was like rereading it is.
But how he structures it, he wants to kind of implant in you that we're kind of in and out of time. So how that would kind of like land on an audience person could go multiple ways in this way. It could make you feel immediate. It could make you feel like you're catching up to something that's already really, actually, I do think the intention is that you have to catch up to something that's already in motion, right? So basically, it's like a kind of paranoia. Like there is a crisis happening and you don't know the gravity of it. You got to get abreast to it. So you get like rushed up into it. And then you get kind of put into this kind of nexus. And then to kind of, once you get caught up, you're through Odysseus, you're able to kind of release it all and get prepared. And then there's an invocation at the end of it that the project is not finished. You've kind of going through this like cathartic process that is like kind of priming you for how you need to situate yourself in this kind of current civilizational crisis, right? And, you know, through that, you watch, you know, John Leguizamo be a loyal person. You get to watch Robert Pattinson be a bad person, you know, and, you know, it just situates you. It just puts you in the kind of proper position to be primed to kind of say react to it in this way to protect this civilization, right? But it's all in the form as well, as bad as he is at doing form.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was just gonna say he does that with Interstellar too, like, which is also like a space colonialism movie, right? And like the first part of it is like you could actually be like, wait, he's like pro-colonialism, and then the last 80% of the movie is like the mechanics of it. So you're like, oh, we're not supposed to think about any of the ideology. We're just trying to get you trying to get the spaceship home, basically, or get them complete their mission. And then he has Matt Damon in Interstellar, who's like kind of just arbitrarily evil. Like it's very similar to what you're talking about, where you're like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then it's like, oh, he's the bad colonist, or we don't, you know, he's bad. Yay, Matthew McConaughey. You know, it's like, it's very much this sort of simple thing again, where he sets this up, and it's like, yeah.
So one thing that was on my mind, even from the first time that I rewatched, like that part that I reread there, as he's doing that speech, is the first time in the film that you're presented with the full scale of what happened in Troy after they breached the gates, basically, right? Because there's an earlier scene where Menelaus is describing what it was like to be in the horse and all of that, and then leads right up to like the moment where they open the gates and Agamemnon and everybody come in. But this is where this is kind of the prestige of the film, right? Or the reveal of the film is that, you know, the person who we've thought was Athena all along, right, is a young lady who he watches presumably defiled and then had her head chopped off, is the way I would say. But I mean, at least her head is chopped off, right? And they also chop off the statue of Athena's head at the same time and all of this kind of stuff. And as I was watching it, like, I can't help, I think just I'm traumatized by watching years of like videos, you know, from Gaza and Lebanon and, you know, Iran and so on and so forth, right? Of people just dealing with this onslaught of force. But then I was like, like what happens to, he talks about the 10 years of rage that's built up. He talks about opening this gate, right? And I talked to you about this, Gemma, a little bit over text. Like, I was like, I'm not sure whether he's talking about October 7th here, or if that's what this imagery is meant for us to like transport ourselves into, or if it's supposed to transport us into Gaza or maybe Ukraine, right? Because of like Nolan's chaotic kind of, and it's not like he's somebody who's very out there with like, this is my politics on all of this stuff. But this was what I thought was really interesting is I watched a video from one of the worst people in the history of the world, New York Times opinion columnists, Ezra Klein, right? Who loves this movie, thinks this movie is the greatest thing ever, right? And he said in a little clip of it as a part of his like 15-minute monologue about it, he said, When Nolan's Odysseus recalls sacking of Troy, he blanches at the memory of 10 years of rage and fury pouring into a city in a single night. Sitting in that theater, I felt it hard not to think of the built-up rage that Hamas poured into Israel on October 7th, and that Israel has poured into Gaza 100-fold since. Right. So then he does it, it's the moral equivalency, right? Of like both of these things are these violations, which I do think is probably the intended effects of Nolan, right? Is to kind of say that both of these things are violations of Zeus's law or of Xenia or however he's trying to have that discussion, right? And these breaches are leading to this decline of civilization, and I mean the fact that he puts it in civilizational terms and that he's um narrating the Odyssey through kind of Judeo-Christian morality versus a Greek morality leads me to believe that like he's more concerned with the guilt-ridden IDF soldier, right, than anything else here. He's not really thinking about but the question of, are we the people of the sea, right? We didn't talk about the people of the sea, but the people of the sea are discussed about throughout the film, even from very early on. And there's this fear of them coming. And obviously, I mean, this, like, as you're just hearing it in the audience, people of the sea, I mean, the things I think about, right, are like immigrants, particularly him being from Europe, also thinking about people crossing like the Mediterranean or Gibraltar or whatever to get into Spain and so on and so forth. But the fear that they have of the people of the sea is like, one, they don't know your customs or your traditions, but also they violate. They're people who like kind of ransack and rape and pillage. And what you learn throughout the film is that it's Odysseus and his crew basically that are the people of the sea. They are the ones, like, as they go through this journey to these different places, they're the ones who are like constantly violating all of these things. And of course, his solution at the end, right, is just for like Matt Damon to kill everybody and then get on a boat and say, like, let's sail west and establish a new civilization. And our story will only be sung because they'll forget those of us that knew how to write, despite the fact that ancient Greeks did not know how to fucking write, and all of this stuff. But yeah, so that was the part I think that was most bothersome to me about the film, is that I do think that even though there's not like direct parallels or whatever, it is just kind of this thing that they're like, anytime I see that kind of imagery in films nowadays of this, like, this war with tremendous destruction, and then either just justifying it, right, which is often done in films just to kind of, I think, like, Mandalorian and Grogu, to cite one of the summer's great films, does, I think, a very like pro, like, just bomb everybody and it's all good thing at the end of it. But this one does, I'm joking that it's good. This one, takes this kind of guilt-ridden thing, but it's the civilizational guilt, right? It's not like the, are these people really barbarous? Like, this kind of thing. It's really just this concern about Western civilization.
I mean, you can go to the second Dark Knight, because, well, like, what's the reason why I told people? I remember people love that fucking movie, and I remember I walked out of the movie pissed off, and they said, why? I said, well, this is just you could use this movie to defend George Bush, like, completely, because you're basically saying this mass surveillance apparatus, yes, it's bad, but it was fundamentally necessary for this precise moment, right? And that it will fundamentally fuck up some things, but it's a needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few kind of thing. It's a very, but the thing that, like, movies that are in love with war love to do is that the victims of war, their totality is actually imprinted on the person who was the victimizer, right? So the empathy thus goes through them. And so, I mean, like, I also have to say, using a pop star Zendaya as the, like, as the guilt image for the movie. There's also all of that, and also kind of how she gets used in that with Euphoria, which I haven't watched, but I did pay attention to a little bit of the discourse about the end of that show, about her like dying of like a drug overdose or some shit like that, and her being this like symbol, right, of like this pop star becoming the symbol of like our large empathies, right? But it's all getting acted through Matt Damon. And I think to your point, Jay, this knowing how these kind of filmmakers work, I think they do think violence is this large general soup, right? So whatever you were to pull from it would be good for them. They don't have a specificity. They actually think all of it is fodder to kind of get on their. That's why Ezra Klein can then write that. This movie is made for the Ezra Kleins of the world, right? But I think also Nolan probably knows, maybe not this like that in front of his head, but he knows, kind of similar to Superman, in an unsophisticated kind of analysis. I hate to say that word, I'm sorry, but like someone could even also say, well, that, yeah, this is like guilt of like, he's dealing with the guilt of an IDF soldier or something like that. And they could find it being somewhat kind of, if they have a certain kind of read on these kind of things and they're primed for this kind of stuff. So I do think there's a chaos in it that like it is all of it in that kind of way. And he wants to make it like open enough, right, that he can basically get whatever he can in that way, right? He can get the Ukraine folk, he can get this folk, I can get it all. Right. And I can bring them all to me. I mean, and that to me is like evil in its own way.
I think that kind of goes exactly to the sort of violence of humanization argument too, because the other thing that is pretty, and Jay read the book more recently, but like, I feel like one of the big formal issues I had with it was, given that he's like the game filmmaker, like he likes to do little puzzles, none of the trials were really trials. Like I like the Cyclops thing that was imprinted on me from high school. But the part of that is because really no one else he encounters has, we could use Greek terms, has like logos, has like, speech or reason. Even the way the Cyclops is depicted is not. Again, I watched the Italian one. There's a much longer sequence with him, and it's like the whole nobody thing, which was really clever. It's like, okay, this is, like there's kind of like a reasoning. It's almost like not a dialectic like in the Greek sense, but there's something like that going on. There's kind of like a logical trial going on, so like one of the things that I think does affirm a lot of what you're saying is that the so-called other, doesn't really get a voice in this. And even Zendaya is just his consciousness. She's not like, this is the Troy. I rewatched the Wolfgang Peterson Troy, and I was like, this is much better. It's not a great movie, but I was like, it's actually way better. Like it's way more interesting in terms of how it, like you get a lot of Troy, you get a lot of the, and you get a lot of the, it doesn't, so much, you get some of the class politics too, because they're also like, even the Achilles character is like, yeah, we're just fighting for rich people. He's like, even though he's, it's not like he's poor, he has like a title and stuff because he's a successful fighter, but there is like even basic stuff like that. Like it's not radical, but it's like, oh, at least there's kind of like during the Bush War, which I guess that was 2004, so it'd have been or wars I should say plural. It was kind of like, oh, there's at least something there. Whereas, not that you probably, I mean, I'm sure it could be taken another direction. It's not that ideologically robust or whatever, but it is much more substantive than what we're getting here, where there really is, it almost is like the other has been obliterated, like in the way the film has, like, there's not, it's kind of the liberal Zionist stand, there's that meme where it's like anti-Zionist Jews and it's like 100 microphones and then a Palestinian has one. And it's kind of that sort of argument where you're like, there's always a way liberalism finds to push the sort of like who gets the voice type of argument. And it is literally, there's nothing we see of Troy. A lot of the people are wearing helmets in it that discover the horse, like we don't really see their face or hear them talk much. It's not a society that we would understand to be having like reason or anything really. It's just like a victim. I think it's more insidious than the other representations of us. And again, I include the arguably peak of blockbuster, which is also military term we talk about the origins of the blockbuster. 2000s, that Wolfgang Peterson, and I was like, I was shocked to be like, this is actually more political in a way, and just kind of, it's just a better film too. It's again not a great film, but I was just like, oh, there's like, why, there's drama, there's scene stage, there's arguments, there's like, I get like some cultural sense of thing, whereas you kind of get the sense that he really is kind of to the knower thing, is that he's almost like, even the whole Zeus's Law thing in it feels, I mean, how many times they say it in this movie? Like, it's like, it doesn't feel like this is a way of understanding culture so much as a device. It's like the top, it's like the whatever. It's like, oh, I can use this to kind of, I mean, if he's a as philosophically deep a filmmaker as some people tend to think, which I obviously don't agree with that, it's like a hammer. You're like, not, that's why it's every cut is every, there's never these kinds of opposition stage. There's never, and so, yeah, one thing I just found boring about it was that there really wasn't a lot of other characterization. Like, none of the people that he encounters, even if I remember, Circe doesn't really, except for what y'all mentioned, who turns them all into pigs. I think she was the closest one to having a moment where it was like, this is a, one of the villains gets to actually speak back, so to speak. But it does go to, like, when you bring up the Batman point, where, I mean, I probably watched the Bane movie a bunch when I was doing it. It doesn't ever make sense. You're like, oh, it's like he's not actually anti-capitalist, but I don't, it's kind of what y'all talked about the Imperial 80s, where it's like the quote unquote the terrorist is just this like irrationally like terror, they're like twirling their mustache and blowing up buildings, and it's like it's not, you don't necessarily, I don't think that there's a figure like that in this, but the other part of that logic that is very essential to his film is there, like the guilt-ridden, maybe it's kind of inferred since he's such a brand now, like whatever oh, the terrorism was me after all, or so, like it feels like, yeah, there is no actual humanity of the other in this in any challenging way whatsoever. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's also like his trick in a certain way is to make Odysseus and his crew the other in the end, right? Because they have like violated the laws. But this is why, to me, I have so many issues with the film, right? Because it's like they're not punished as a result of this. I mean, he's going into exile, right? But like his son gets to be king. They kill everybody. That's fine, and they go off to establish their new, I mean, it was a joke that you and I were having, Gemma, of like, are they going to colonize Turtle
North
Island
America?
right now, or is it like, or are they going to establish Rome? Like, what is the, what are we supposed to believe is happening here? But I think that the broader sort of thing is just like, well, when Zeus's law is violated, right? That, at the end of the day, you can just kill everybody and go somewhere else and start over, right? Like, which is a very, very white Euro, like Western civilizational view, honestly. I mean, that's what was happened in a lot of ways. And yeah, so anyways, yeah, go ahead. Did you want to say something to me?
No, that's just actually, I laughed because that's really what it is. But there was also that joke at the end of Game of Thrones, right? With what's her name? Little homegirl who was the youngest daughter.
Aya,
right? When she goes up on the ship, she's gonna become an explorer. There's all the memes there, like she's about to be. So she's the colonizer, right? Like where's she coming to the Americas, right? Like.
Which is also, it's worth always reiterating, he was punished for 20 years. It is also
I have something to say about that, but go ahead.
Okay. It is also worth reiterating too that like the Pilgrims, part of the essential nature of settler colonial ideology, and you see this with Zionism, is there has to be some form of victimhood with it, right? Like it has to be like its justification, its Christological justification is, I was victimized, therefore I have to, you could see it as repairing a kind of social notion of guilt, or, so I do think it is like, that doesn't obviate like the criticisms. Like, it's not like it's just, and in a way also too, it's interesting to think about the stereotypical nature of like the depiction of sort of Roman colonization might, often makes right, like crystallized as it being less one I mean, even though I don't think this is true of the Greeks, it's a very Christian idea of like, oh, you were victimized, therefore the way you respond to it has something to do with that. But of course, it's something we only understand as, something, a possession of the colonizer. Like, oh, they have been wrong. Like, oh, the Pilgrims, they were religiously persecuted. Therefore they can make you go to Liberia. You go to a lot of examples of a settler colony where it's like there has to be the original harm, the original. So it's very possible to read that into it, or to what's going to happen next. To I think Mtume's point that like, oh, we,
For sure. I mean, so to this thing, so I just disagree. I mean, I think that we could point to a couple parts in the film, but also in the book. But I mean, one, in the book, Athena is the one who advocates and is like, to get him away from Calypso, which happens right in the beginning of it, and goes to all the gods, and they all love him basically, and they're like, yeah, send him home. In the film, the sin that keeps him out so long, or that he thinks is, or actually maybe it's his men think, right, is the Poseidon, thing. The thing that the film does that I don't, again, can only be reconciled through this, like, he's favored by the gods, he is a singular important figure, which I think is something we need to come back to, because I think this is very Nolan, all of this, is that his whole team, which, I mean, I get the idea is, well, he didn't actually, he did the violation to let everybody in Troy, but he doesn't participate in the raping and pillaging, which is also like not believable given him and his violence and all of this kind of stuff, right? And what did he think was going to happen, sort of thing. But he feels guilty for that, right? But it is really the interaction with Poseidon's son, the Cyclops, right, which is seen as the thing that angers Poseidon. And that is what keeps him off at sea for all of that time, right? And in the movie, the way they deal with that is sort of a strange thing, because you're not really clear whether Odysseus believes in the gods at all. He talks about, the gods favor those who make their own luck, a very like prosperity gospel kind of view of the gods and so on. And but his men believe this, right? So they believe that as they're in these storms and all of this stuff, that it is Poseidon. And what eventually happens is that they're killed off because they eat Apollo's cattle ultimately, right? And anger Apollo and the other gods, but they still preserve him to get him home, right? And they still, you know, favor him in this battle against all of these suitors as well. And then, he has the exile thing, which I do think is a little bit chaotic. I mean, it's sort of explained as like, killing all of these suitors would just create all of these enemies from these other powerful families and things like this. And so he has to do it as some form of justice or whatever. But I don't think, I mean, in this version, I don't think you're supposed to believe he's being punished, because even there's the discussion he has with Athena as they're leaving Apollo's island, where, she has something about, do you see this or do you see consequence? And he's like, I see consequence, but he's talking about himself. And she's like, no, the consequence is for them. Like, they're the ones who violated the law, essentially. And so I think that's one of the things about the film. And it may be somewhat justifiable within Greek mythology, because I think, and this is maybe where we could talk about some resonance between Nolan's way of viewing things and something that could go back to the Greeks, right? Which is that the hero, right, is this character that's kind of a bridge between humanity and the gods, and that they're allowed to basically do whatever because they're favored by the gods, but mortal men have to submit themselves essentially to all of what the gods have. And and I think that that's like, it's kind of Oppenheimer. I mean, it's kind of a lot of, it's very tech bro-ish too. It's like this idea of people being, individuals being able to do kind of what, if we don't allow some individuals who are special to transgress these things and do all of this stuff, then we won't innovate, we won't have civilization, we won't be able to, preserve it, all of these kinds of things. So
yeah, I mean, how I experienced that was that not that he was cursed, but he was given trials. And this is like totally a hero's journey kind of affect, right? Where he's given trials because he is the favored one who could do it, which is, the other shitty thing they consistently love to do about armies. And that, naturally, where maybe his second in command, played by the South Asian brother, that the South Asian brother does have talents, but he does not have the favorable whatever kind of social position. And this is also interesting because I think it kind of gives purchase to what people like Clyde Taylor said about the Enlightenment interpretation of Greeks. And that was like his big criticism, that a lot of what we look at of Greece is an Enlightenment interpretation. So it's interesting to think of Nolan, if he's, and I have always had this feeling that he's into that kind of these various ends of classical liberalism in this kinds of way, that he's taking it through that lens to kind of appropriate it, right, and kind of build this blocks, because then that's how you can see how he would situate all of this and put this together. So in a way, I do think he's arrogant enough, and it's probably what pisses maybe Emily Wilson off. And I don't have a dog in this fight, that he actually thinks he's more correct. He thinks he's making the necessary corrective. This is shit that he'll say over a scotch with QT, over at Cannes one night. You know what I'm saying? Like he'll when QT goes, yeah, bro, it's really great. And he gives him his shit, and then he goes, but you know what I was doing, really, and he kind of like hugs it over. But when he finally tells DiCaprio what Interstellar is about, he gives some, but you know what I was really doing, trying to fuck with them. But yeah, I think a lot of that is, I think, really present in this. But also I think the end of it is fundamentally chaotic. That's like the end of the other part, which you have to go into. I think the harsh critique of liberalism is its chaos. Like what like Lacerda always talks about with liberalism is just, it is such chaotic ideology. They can't even keep their own shit together, right? They're always kind of trying to re-grab, like, It's like that one Freddy Krueger movie where he's trying to like pop out, and they keep trying to like put Freddy back in, right? Like that's the only. It's like that's like we're trying to keep it together, but we can't. That's what it always feels like when they're trying to like create and balance or like level out their ideologies.
Yeah, I think both of those things. One thing, that's why I mentioned the Wolfgang Peterson Troy, is that there is like a sense that the soldiers are like, we're just being sacrificed for like someone in the chat used the word hubris a lot, and both is real, and it is true. Like, and I feel like, I don't know if it's a Shakespeareism or whether it's like endemic to ancient Rome, but like ambition in Caesar, so it's like these kinds of, or I think guile is also used a lot. These are translations from what I remember of the Odyssey. And so it is kind of a thing that is very a translation of the Greeks, but it's, it's like, we could say there's a kind of ethno-chauvinism, which is true, that it exists then, that like, it is like, it's a translation, but it's also not nothing, it's going to come from nowhere. It's like, this is where the notion of like a modern willful subject comes from, is a, of course, specific translation that Nolan, like you're saying, is totally caught up in. And I think we absolutely see that in the kind of, in general, I think this is a pretty consistent part of the depiction of the Odyssey, right? Is like the disposability of his fellow soldiers. It's not like it doesn't make him sad, but it's like, if you kind of think of it in the modern military context, it is the argument people can make around, you join an imperial military, and it's like, well, yeah, you are obviously, look at what the people you're oppressing feel first, but it's also like, you're not going to benefit from this either. Like in most cases in the long run, except the few exceptional individuals. And in his case, it's interesting too. It kind of does give the game away, the idea that, again, transposing it, you think of the U.S. military or, some other militaries, I'm sure, are like this, as like a meritocratic institution of like, you can move up the ranks, you can become a politician, all this kind of stuff. but it actually with Odysseus, it is like, well, he was highborn, to use the Game of Thronesism, like it's like he's from upper class, that I mean, noble heritage was something you married into or inherited by blood. These other sorts of, and there were other ways to obtain it, but generally speaking, he's not of like the slave class, like the people that are depicted that are his servants. There's even a sense, I think it kind of overlaps with what, Jerry, you're getting at, like of like, oh, that is part of the heroic capacity. And then it's also why, for example, at the end of the film, his wrath, or whatever you want to call it, it's not the best, it's much more Christian word, but like, is justified against the suitors. It's like, oh, because it is about, he, like you're saying, trials. He's proven he is an exceptional being, and that those, in a way, it affirms our class system in Greece. I'm pretending I'm in ancient Greece, because it's not just that he was highborn. He actually did stuff to get there. It's not that he was just granted titles from, which is also funny in this. We don't really see the royal echelon of people, the Agamemnon. They don't really have a line or a so there is a much more intentional, and this also feels like a weird, very contemporary translation into the superhero genre that he works, where it is like, we don't really get a sense of the society. We don't really see in a lot of ways, this film would almost make you think that Odysseus and Agamemnon are like the same level, or you would think that all these characters are kind of on the same social level, which is not true. But, which again, that's maybe like kind of the American part of it or something, or like, but on the other hand, it's like, oh, he really did earn his wealth. He's an exceptional, in his power over people. And again, it's what superhero movies often do, right? I mean, one of the things they often do is kind of affirm like that exceptional, Batman being the example with Nolan, like, oh, he's rich, but we should pay Batman, really, because he's cleaning up all this crime. He does more than the police. It's almost like it's good that he's a billionaire. I mean, in addition to the cop part of it, but like, it feels like that is kind of part of the argument with Batman, is like, he's always gets trials that really are like, oh, he's a billionaire, maybe, and then you kind of get this with the last Batman movie, where the Occupy stuff vaguely had a critique, at least that was a critique of it, is like, oh, the 1%. And it's like, well, but y'all don't know the 1% they be putting in extra work. Actually, he's doing overtime. Y'all just don't see it. And it is kind of that sort of ethos. And so there is some of that, because you're like, oh, he actually, I mean, he breaks his back, all these things that, probably wouldn't happen to a normal person. Like, I don't know that you can survive all the stuff that happens to Batman. People point that out all the time, like that he just would be disabled, right? Like, he'd actually be permanently disabled from all the things, the like wild extra cop work he's doing for fucking free. And there is some of that with Odysseus too, where you're like, oh, he kind of walks out of this unscathed. I mean, it's an interesting way to think about it too. If we were to be really historically, like, everyone would have had health conditions then. Everyone would just like, but for a bunch of reasons. But there is something very insidious about that, to use another channel favorite word. Like, it is very pernicious. It is very like, oh, he really put in the work to earn this back, which it's not like that doesn't exist in Greece. I think it does in a certain way. And it is kind of how the rulers, obviously it's different with in a society where people are less literate, have access, but still, it is the way the rulers justify the rule, both to any sort of subordinate class, is like, oh, these people actually do deserve this. It's not just total mystification or whatever, or arbitrary, Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that back up, because this is another thing that I don't really know how to reconcile, which is like the deep fascination and investment that people have in the Odyssey, like, and in the Iliad, and like, I mean, and I'm not saying that to be glib, right? Like, I've read them. I think that they're interesting, you know what I mean? It's not, I get that they're really, really fucking old, like, and that in itself is interesting because it tells you something about, some long ago thing. But there's a way that people are like invested, as if somehow the social relations within them are something that you want to go back to, or that there's a strong basis of the social relations that are there in what our societies are like now, right? Like, which I don't think either of those things are good at all. I mean, obviously we don't want to go back there. Like there's slavery, there's like the patriarchy is just off the scale, right? All of these things. But and I know that the right does want to go back there, right? Which I do think that's a tell when you see the people just really pissed about that this is not accurate enough, and we need to, recover some of these Greek values. But this whole idea of building, there's all this work that has gone into building this idea of Western civilization and and this idea of these continuities between, Greek civilization. And even to think that a story like this is like you said, Gemma, like it's created to convey certain values to justify the social relations that already exist, right? And I mean, in some ways, Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, you could argue, is like just like Homer's Odyssey in that way, right? Is that it's looking at certain social relations and things that exist now, right? And saying, this is just a way to justify how these things are. But I really want people to want better things than either of these, Yeah, go ahead and do it.
Well, yeah. And I'm going to be a little generous and careful in this one right here, because like there is a lot of discourse that I do think goes to that on right and left that we need to return to not in the Cabral way, return to the source. That's not what I'm saying. But that like the older civilizational relationships is not what we need to be studying, but what we need to kind of go back to. And there's a way that we end up idealizing things that we probably don't understand that well because the source material is the Odyssey. You know what I'm saying? And things like that, or its equivalents. And it just gets into a space where you're not looking at the contemporary developments of societies throughout, thousands of years and all the different things that have happened, right? And this is kind of just my stance. You aren't doing that, and there becomes this fetishization of that, right? And it has like variants. Some of it is like the classic, Eat, Pray, Love weird shit that you see the Upper West Side Julia Roberts types do, and then some of it you see in kind of fetishizations of yoga and all types of stuff from people who are not Julia Roberts types, right? And there's these kinds of like orientations, and I think they kind of fit with all of this, right? With this kind of fascination, because it's funny. The Odyssey for me, I remember when I read it, as I think I was in my freshman year. And I did have this very like liberal teacher. Remember, she had like the little gloves, white lady. She was very cool. She was like, this book has lots of problems, but it's very important. So we're gonna read it, And then I remember I would say shit. I'd be like, but he did that, and she goes, yes, Mtume, I know it's very challenging. It was like really hilarious because I would be like, this is weird, but I didn't, But I have no want, but. To the point is like dissatisfaction with current society and the looking towards the past as the way to kind of fix things and past social relations. To me, I have a lot of challenges with that as a kind of orientation, right? I could be more specific in another conversation about the various strands of that, but I have a lot of challenges.
Revanchism, right?
Yeah.
I
mean,
yeah.
And I think it's also, I feel like this is very true, not to like too singularly characterize this period we're in, but I think, people will talk about how heightened periods of fascism have nostalgia built into them. And I think there's also, because that's also, maybe this isn't really that different from a lot of the nostalgia culture that is the cores, like like, and there's but this is like, kind of like nostalgia culture for people who don't think, nostalgia culture is very like gendered in age, like it's young girls or young teenagers, like that's who's supposed to have that kind of culture, not big tough men, it's much more kind of to your point about the kind of MAGA arguments, but I do think these kinds of things exist on the left too, where people are like, oh, we need to go back to the way things were during this period, and it's kind of not really I think a lot of it is, this is getting a little off the path, but I think you have a lot of guests on the show that talk about this, who do like organizing stuff, that are like, well, it's like in profound isolation, and it's like the same way people live through the fantasy of these images is the same way they live through the fantasy of screens in their personal life. I mean, I think that's partially why the attention economy aesthetic of Nolan's visuals are what they are. And it's very true of someone like Terrence Malick, like I said, like it's very much like, oh, how you appeal to people sentimentally now too is constant montage, since that's kind of what they're subjected to. Like they're allegedly, and I don't know if this is actually true, I feel like I know a lot of young people who can watch a movie or a play, but right, the kind of pulled from the internet clickbait sort of thing is like, oh, they can't watch a sustained sort of thing, so like, these we have to update our sort of like languages of sentimentality and meaning making. But yeah, I think a lot of nostalgia is also rooted in the recognition of its impossibility, right, too. And I think that is a certain thing that people want, a belief that is pacifying in a certain way, or like Marx would use the word quietist or quiet. Yeah, I think quietist, but like where, oh, I don't have to do anything, like it just is better to feel like things were better back in the day without, and that you in a way, you all kind of talked about this with Back to the Future a little bit too, which is obviously a nostalgia movie more, which again, to kind of think of the relationship. But again, I think Nolan's very Zemeckis-like, which is not a compliment, of course. Is like, oh well, history is just this thing that it's so beyond me. It's a mechanical process, to use a Nolan ism, more or less. Like it's a mechanical process that's beyond me. The farther away something is from me, the more I can yearn from it. I have no ability to, create like a positive public in my life, because this is sort of the world that people have been increasingly given by power, and including the systems that we're defending with the movie, like, oh, save Hollywood, like it's like save the. I mean, it's I think, there's without getting too far off the path, like I said, it's like I think there is a relationship to that sort of nostalgic. I mean, it's interesting to think again, kind of those like that I was referring to, like in the 70s, where people are kind of trying to, maybe in the sort of like Brechtian way or other ways, like think through these things, like how can these help us actually solve things now? Like don't look at the screen, look at yourselves, kind of an argument. But I think IMAX is the opposite of that. Literally, it's like we've given up on the movie screen. We're too afraid someone's going to text during it, I guess, or something. Even to someone who actually, I maybe would prefer to watch movies at home because I can rewind and subtitles. But we have to, now the aspiration of an IMAX screen is like you're going on the Universal Studios ride every single movie or something like that. Like you're totally surrounded. It's like, oh, we are terrified to give people this kind of, like to do away with the audience. We have to reconstitute the audience. If you're to think about it that way, and these sort of. I think the other thing we didn't talk about necessarily with this movie too, and this whole period, is like, and this is very similar to the 50s when they invented things like CinemaScope or VistaVision, is like they were very afraid of TV taking over, right? Because TV in the 50s is getting big. I think y'all kind of referred to this also again in Back to the Future. And so they're like, oh, well, we have to beat the little screen, like we don't have to go into like the breakup of the studio system and stuff too, which is involved in this. But like, we have to get the audience back, basically, to use that language. And obviously we're in a moment where that's very much the case. They're like, how do we bring people back to theaters? And there is a very weird personalization of that I think kind of relates to what you're talking about with text, where I'm like, you don't make any money from the movie theater, average person, me or any of us, but there's like a weird erudition or like self-appointed part, like of like, oh, we need to get people back to the theaters. There are a lot of people that are into movies that take that up in an intense way, and I'm like, they're not paying these AMC workers anymore or whatever. So that's the theater near me, like like the chain, at least they're not building out the it's like, so it is a strange project that further speaks to, like, I think what people want, like if you want to say like a public discourse on films, that's not what the theater is, or like whatever, or plays or something. Like I think like a kind of theater, that's not the discourse on the movie theater. But it's kind of like you're saying with the text, where people are like, we need to go back to when movies were big, and that you think of the 90s or the 80s that you're all talking about on the thing all the time. And it's kind of like, yeah, this is what nostalgia does. You know, it makes you think. Sure, the present is bad, but it makes you think there's nothing. You know, there's no possibility for it to change outside of regression or yeah. So.
I was to say instead of save the whales, you have save the movies, right? You know, that'd be the new campaign.
I mean, and it's funny too because this is being touted right now, but last weekend was the biggest box office weekend in history. Like just from a now, of course, that's not adjusted, right? Because money is worth much less now. I mean, yeah, like you're paying more for less, right? So like people spending the same amount of money in the 80s or the 70s, right, would be way more. But two Tom Holland and Zendaya vehicles, right? Like between this and Spider-Man lifted the box office, and John Barenthal, right, is both in both of them as well.
John Barenthal, man, the secret weapon.
I love how he's just always uncomfortable. You're like, are you wearing an uncomfortable outfit? It's always his acting thing. Is he goes in there and he's like his shoulders. I'm just like, you gotta.
and him and Lupita in a 2-shot is hilarious because he's like this, and Lupita's
yeah, she's like a statue. Yeah, no, it's so no, it feels yeah.
Oh, so a couple of minor things, and then if you want to talk more about anything else, we can. But just things that I had made notes about that I just want to name. I mean, one, I think we did address it at some point, but a decent part of this film was shot in Western Sahara, right? And the indigenous people had called for a boycott, which unfortunately I violated 3 times and was not effective on a global scale either. But I think it points to also how little Nolan gives a shit about like what could, because he did not have any permission from the communities there or anything like that to do that. How little he cares about any of that stuff. And, you know, that it, to your point, I think one of you, I think, yeah, Gemma, you talked about, is he pro-colonization? Like, I think he is, you know, like, I think we could probably say that that seems to be a trend. Then additionally, yeah, it's a minor point, but they make sense. They make sure to emphasize trade routes a couple of times. One, it's the small little caveat he gives, I think, to like the materialists, just like a little bit, to say not do what Troy did, right? To what you raised, Gemma, of talking about them understanding that they're fighting for rich folks, right? But to say that this justification around the stolen wife is not really real, it's really about the trade routes, right? Which also, whatever. I mean, like, maybe that's also a way that he can treat that as not a violation of Zeus's law in a certain way, so that he can have this other conversation about Zeus's law, but whatever. But the reason I bring that up is also Vijay Prashad notes that as well in his piece, because this is one of the things within, you know, kind of the successes, right, of the rules-based order, is that the United States has been a sort of guarantor of trade. And there's all of this, of course, consternation now that Iran and Yemen have been able to disrupt trade during the illegal wars against their countries that have taken place over the last few years and against Palestine, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that, but I just think it's again like just him kind of pointing towards this modern era. And it's kind of, you know, Ezra Klein, of course, reads this as a very anti-Trump film, which is, I'm like, whatever, like, I don't see it as that way, but I see ideologically what he's trying to do, right? Which is to preserve aspects of the ideology being promoted and like pull him over to my abundant side of the table or whatever. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not anti-Trump. It's Trump be a better leader. That's
Yeah.
And that's what I see all these films always as, is these elite conversations, right? And it's funny, someone brought up in the chat about like the domestic violence with like Bernal and That would be Helen of Troy, right? In the suggestion of all that, and Clytemnestra and her, and like this, what it is, he gives all these like seeds of like fucked up leadership, right, and all these men dealing with it. So he's like, it's a bros, it's like it's the country club conversation with the fucking cigars, and they're talking about leadership, and this is the movie, and he's like, guys, how do we be better leaders? You see this thing that you did that has problems. Don't do that, right? This is what we do, right? And he's giving them his leadership training for elites in a 3-hour fucking movie, you know, that we all have. But the fucked up thing is we all have to sit through it who can never be in that leadership position, right? And it's like also like it's like get in line, you know, but totally, that's what I totally think he thinks it is. This is a message to them.
Yeah. The other thing too, just quickly, is like, yeah, I mean, we've talked about the suitors and how this is treated. I mean, the slaves, right, are given there's never anything about their, like, any struggle related to them at all. Like, if anything, they're kind of trying to, most of them are joining in with the suitors and kind of plotting. Like, that's kind of the best that they can hope for, is to sort of plot to be in a better favored position and so on.
Mia Goth is so bad in that movie. Mia Goth is just terrible. She's like the worst woman in history.
But Robert Pattinson's character, again, he's also a draft dodger. Right. And this is dealt with in a very particular way. Right. He's dealt with as like he sends his little shepherd boy off to war for him, and then, tries to sleep with Odysseus's wife and doesn't help out the family that he did, that did this favor for him for taking up his draft. So it's like it has a very particular orientation towards people also who think they shouldn't fight in wars. And there's the if you notice at the end when Ulysses refers, or not Ulysses, that's funny. Odysseus refers to himself as a veteran of the Trojan War. He does this very like a veteran of the Trojan War, ha ha ha, like laughing at like how absurd this is, like, so it's like, I'm like, he's the fucking, this is Nolan going after the leftist here, right? And making him just like the worst human being ever, right? Because he avoids the war. He's laughing at the veteran, like all these bad tropes about people who are opposed to war, which I think also is one of the things, with this, is that it's not at all an anti-war movie, right? It is like a question of what happens when you break certain like civilizational orders, but it's not at all anti-war, and it, of course, it ends in a massacre. But anyways, all right, I'll stop there.
The one thing I was going to add too about the Trump part and the other part is that, and I can't say I know enough about it to say this, but I was reading, there's a Nietzsche line where he's critical of the Roman interpretation of Odysseus, and he's like, which I actually think is just maybe the dominant interpretation, which is like he was a trickster, kind of like he was sort of scheming and stuff. And that, you could maybe say like the person in the chat that was like, oh, he's punished for 20 years. But I do think to the Trump argument and to the Trump be a better leader argument, it's kind of like, don't trick, don't use tricks, don't use deceit or something like that. It's kind of like, again, if we think of a contemporary example, the fake ceasefires with the U.S., where it's like, oh yeah, or probably while we're doing this, he probably tweeted out there's another deal with it on or something, and it is one of the things I think about that is I actually think before to the Biden, the Biden era, where the resurrection of like the less tricky war criminals who, I mean, even if we're looking at like, they literally have all these records of the same kind of shit. Like there's no difference. It is like, oh, these are fine, moral, upstanding war criminals, but there is something about like the affect of it. Like, oh, we don't like and I also think that's why Robert Pattinson's character, I was a little like thrown off when he has more lines during the Suitor massacre, whatever you call it, where he's like, get them. And it's almost like a Batman villain. I was like, what are you doing? Like, it took me out of it. I was like, are you the Riddler from like the 60s Batman too? I was like, oh wow, that just And but it's to that point where it's kind of like you were saying about the draft dodging point. It's like, oh, you shouldn't have to use subterfuge, which also feels just like it is a weird, again, nostalgia of US imperialism, where people fantasize that the US used to have like direct forms of engagement as opposed to what has always been some form of proxy warfare or counterinsurgency. You'll talk about counterinsurgency a lot on the channel, like, and you're like, that has never existed. Like it almost feels like when y'all have done films about Vietnam where it's like the people who are like, we should just drop bigger bombs, like that would have been, the problem was they were trying to get us to fight in the jungle too, when you talk about Platoon or any of those movies. And it's like, yeah, it also feels like that is part of, I think when y'all did Platoon, you talked about this, where it's like, oh, these people are savages for using guerrilla tactics. Like that's part of the implication, is like, we should have some form of direct, if we were to even, but again, they're not depicted in the film, but the Trojans or anyone, but like, we should be better, we should be morally better in the genocides we commit or something. Like we shouldn't have to stoop to their level, like in Vietnam, or, you're kind of seeing this with some of the aspects of the guerrilla warfare being fought now, where it's like, oh, we shouldn't have to stoop to using drone. Well, I mean, obviously the US are pioneer drones, but like, any of these sort of like smaller form missiles that we can totally read it onto like a nostalgia for the shock and awe, right? Of the idea that like big US military ships used to be able to do, which you could probably read it. I never thought about reading it in terms of the US Navy specifically, or the US NATO Navy, whatever you want to call it, call it. But yeah, that kind of direct, quote unquote, direct warfare, as if that was, yeah. And it makes me think, for example, when the US attacked one of the Iranian submarines or ships and like didn't go back to rescue people probably remember that, which was it was like, and people were even pointing out, this was kind of wild, where it was like even the Nazis rescued like people if they like, or I don't know if that happened in every case, but like it was sort of laws of the sea, to use that, probably what would he had. So there is a point of that, like you can be like, oh, it was so much better back in the day, but it feels like, yeah, it's just the same kind of nostalgia machine that exists to extend militarism. Like we can correct the rules of imperial warfare, as opposed to abolish the warfare. Yeah.
Well, where I got the unprincipled attackers though was the Giants. The way they did the Giants this go around. I don't remember from like the book, right? The fact that they would lose like a little kid to bait them, right? And they're voiceless. They're probably like that in the book. I don't remember the sequence, but that's like it is like these. They're gonna be this like unprincipled brutality, right? And they have a strength, and distorting them in that kind of way gives, it helps stokes the paranoia, but they're totally unprincipled in how they go, and in like the brutality of like breaking the ships and all that. They're just totally ambushed, and of course also with Cersei as well. But they somewhat try to humanize maybe her in a particular kind of way, but still kind of say she's unprincipled, but for a reason. At the same token, she is unprincipled, essentially.
Well, Cersei, like, so again, like, one thing to say, Emily Wilson's complaints are that there's not enough sex in this movie, because there's no sex in this movie. It's just like, I need lots of sex.
Hilarious.
Because the Odyssey there's a lot of it in the Odyssey, of course. And Cersei is a part of that. I mean, I take Cersei's character as, she actually says, she's revealing the true character of these men by turning them into pigs. And she talks about like, you think that the qualities that make them a soldier, right, like go away or something like that. She's like, these men rape and pillage. She actually uses that language. And so there is a way, I mean, I think Odysseus is allowed a certain purity in this film because he doesn't participate in that in Troy, and everybody else kind of does. But the point you made too about trickster stuff is a good one, Jemma, because this is one of Emily Wilson and other classicists' complaints about this film. And they kind of were like, well, we knew this would be the case once they casted Matt Damon, because he's not smart enough to trick anybody, basically. But the whole idea is that, yeah, Odysseus is kind of like Loki. Like Odysseus as a character in Greek mythology is similar to Loki. His it's about his cunning and his ability to like outsmart people and so like the Trojan horse is like one of the primary examples, but it's also Cyclops, it's all these other things, right? And he doesn't have that. Nolan kind of replaces it as a strategist to sort of move away from that, but he completely removes the real trick energy, which I think is only done to kind of preserve the point that you're making, Gemma, because it wouldn't work. The trickster is the gorilla in a certain way, right? Like they are the one that like figures out, okay, how do I do more with less? Like how do I overcome these odds that are stacked against me? And I think that's one of the things people typically like about Odysseus, right? Is that he's not a god and he's not Achilles even, right? Who's like invulnerable except for his ankle and all of that stuff. Like, but he's able to outsmart and outwit and eventually get home. And none of that is in this version. But I think it's because it would conflict with the other thing that Nolan is trying to do, which is like the guilt-ridden leader of war criminals, basically. Like
And it also strikes me, this is maybe going a bit far afield too, but thinking of like just like, because I rewatched Tenet, I was telling you, I was like, I mean, I don't think it's his worst movie, because I think that where he tries to have more ideas are usually his worst movies, but but I do think there's something, especially when you think of, you were talking about the last Batman movie, in a way, I also think about how the form of tricksterism of the US is like economics. Like that is the religion of the, like that is the discourse of mystification of the US and US capitalism, obviously. Like, and it's kind of one of those things where that form of, which technically kills more people than warfare. There was, I think, a Lancet study that were like 500,000 people a year die from. It was something, it might have been more than that, but it was like, which I think almost half the world is under economic sanctions from the US. And it's kind of the way you think about how that was sort of an acceptable form of, they're like, that's fine, as long as we don't see it. I mean, it is kind of the old liberal adage, like, as long as we don't see. And so it is, the other way to think of too, the tricksterism too, is I feel like to make him a trickster, it would have to kind of confront that sort of aspect, which, as we know from the Batman movies, he doesn't really have a criticism of. It doesn't feel like he has a real criticism of. He's like, well, that's the way economics work and markets and all that. Like, there's not really a critique of, the mystification of systems of power. It's more like you're saying, that the irrational, the unprincipled mystification, and we'd probably use the word barbarity, like, which is of the giants, which I did think that was really annoying, how little, I don't remember if it's in the book, but how little of them we got, because I was like, I thought it was kind of a cool looking, so I was like, oh, that's interesting. They're there for like 8 seconds, so it was, yeah.
was there more, Gemma, that you wanted to talk about with regard to like the cinema scope and all of that? I mean, you kind of did touch on those points about the form piece. I don't know if there's anything either of you want to talk more about form with this.
I would just point out, I found this really interesting. I think a lot of what we're talking about too in the humanization aspect, I found this really interesting quote from the 50s where people, Kaye interviewed, it's kind of a famous interview, interviewed Howard Hawks on his very famous Hollywood director about using CinemaScope. And it was one of the first CinemaScope films from the mid 1950s. And he says, what did you concluded from the experience of CinemaScope? So when we think of IMAX, when we think of this, he says, this is Howard Hawks, we've spent a lifetime learning how to compel the public to concentrate on one single thing. Now we have something that works in exactly the opposite way. And I don't like that very much. I don't like it very much. I like CinemaScope for pictures such as The Land of the Pharaohs, which is an interesting movie. Straub called him the only materialist from this film because it's all about architecture. It's very interesting, where it can show things impossible otherwise. But I don't like it at all for the average story. Contrary to what some think, it's easier to shoot in CinemaScope. It's not as clunky as IMAX, which comes a little bit later in history, in the late 60s. You don't have to bother about what you should show. Everything's on the screen. I think we could also talk about the big tent liberalism claims, because I also think there's something about it in IMAX too, like you're seeing everything idea. I find it a bit, and then he says, everything's on the screen. I find it a bit clumsy. Above all, in a motion picture is the story. You cannot shoot a scene as quickly in CinemaScope We kind of talked about that earlier, because if you develop a situation quickly, the characters jump all over the wide screen, which in a way makes them invisible. Thus, you lose speed as a means of exciting or augmenting scenes' dramatic tension. I would say, in a way, that is true of Nolan. Even though his movies are constantly going, I'm like, there's no suspense, because I'm like, no, I don't know what's happening. You have to proceed differently. What you lose in the dramatic plane, however, you gain in the visual plane. The result can be very pleasing to the eye. You have to decide what seems best. I just thought that was a really interesting quote about like the nature of bigger, wider screens, wider scopes, and maybe kind of a way to parallel it to his sort of liberal project, you know, and that idea that you're seeing everything in this frame. And yeah, so that was something I was thinking about. And that during this time, this genre of civilizational film was so essentially tied to the, I guess, like a kind of economic race to, you know, reindustrialize after World War II for a lot of Europe, and the US to kind of become the top imperial power. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that is very interesting. I think if you think about even the nature of the wide angle lens generally, and you could take like two different approaches. If you take, say, like go back to Griffith and not Birth of a Nation, what's the other one?
Intolerance.
Yeah. And the use of the wide, and to kind of show that each piece of the frame, you could get the totality of civilization within it in a single shot, right? But then having the direction of the movement of the object on screen, and this concept that it would really give you the kind of scale and gravity, because Griffith was a hard civilizationalist, and he was really big into that, you know, decline of civilization. And then he has that quote, I believe, where he says specifically, cinema will help us save or restore our cinema. It's a quote like that, right? And that was very much on his brain, right? And then and then it's interesting though, because then if you look at how, say, someone like Globo Rocha, who used a lot of wide and third cinema, he was consistently doing those things like Outside and like Black White Devil, and usually the totality of the destruction of colonialism, of neocolonialism and imperialism. Like when you have Antonio das Muertes at the end, he's transferred into the modern times, and you see the buses, and I think it's Exxon. I think it's an Exxon thing, and he's there, and he's you know, after he's helped defeat like the landowners, and he's walking off, right? How they would approach the use of the wide, not to kind of like pack it up with all this stuff, but to show you the scale of the degradation and what the project needs to happen. Or then even if you get someone like Tarkovsky, who's more spiritual, him using the wide to kind of show how man exists within the kind of existence, but also more about pacing, right? The wide as the opportunity that you could kind of like sit for a while and kind of not have to deal with the excessiveness of montage, right? But Nolan's interest, I think, to Gemma's point, is I notice a lot with the ships, right? And his consistent need to have foreground, midground, background with the ships, the water's crashing on the sides, right? And to kind of show you like the trials and to kind of envelop you in these dangers. The other one that really stuck out was the big scene where he has to see all the dead soldiers, and you got Elliot Page, and like, you know, that was the other one.
The trip to Hades.
The trip to Hades, yeah. And that scene where and Agamemnon, right? You get to see Agamemnon, right? And this is where I haven't read the book in a long time. Is Agamemnon written that distantly in the book?
He's not a very important figure in the Odyssey. So this is another thing just to say.
He's more in the Iliad, right? Yeah. Okay.
Just another thing to say is like this movie, which I don't care about. It doesn't bother me, but like it is a composite of stuff from the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, right? And it's kind of like blended together. So yeah.
So the use of Agamemnon I found very interesting in the outfit, how to kind of consistently situate power, right, as this like distant thing. We can never really touch him, right? And he's a certain kind of power that I don't quite know what Nolan is really trying to kind of say. He might have just had an aesthetic attraction to it. Maybe there's something more to it. but the way he wants to kind of situate the understanding of how power looks, right, and how it kind of feels, and using the wide completely for that. So how powerful we actually are, and I say we, his civilization buddies, his elite buddies, right? How powerful we are. So you're always getting this kind of example. And it's a real limiting way to think about the wide in that kind of way, because you're just trying to use a kind of over aestheticization and packing of the frame with so much. But it's weird because it's not actually a lot of information. It's a very reduced information. It's just very big, right? And like the lines are super defined, right? And
that's the visuals versus images.
Exactly, right? So it's not very defined. So you're getting this impact, right? But I guess the key thing is, and like the siren scene is probably the other one to really say, is to be able to place Odysseus in that tears, right? And then that's when he goes, close to kind of like go in there. But the sirens, and it's funny because I saw an old painting of the sirens where they were actually on the ship. And he doesn't put the sirens on the ship. He makes them distant in this, which I found interesting.
There's a lot.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, like, there's a lot of things that he leaves out and a lot of things that he deals with differently or like just very quickly, which is funny because it's a 3-hour movie. But yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say the wide thing is interesting because it is also goes to the Western Sahara thing too, where I was like, why did he need to shoot this here? And it also, I assume, is something that's a product of the IMAX part too, where you can do landscapes because that's closer to like what it was invented for, right? Is like a lot of documentary stuff. So, which, you can kind of think of that sort of that period of scientific exploration with, inventing cameras that can do scientific exploration in a certain kind of way, colonial, exploration. And then the other part about it is he shoots so many close-ups with no foreground. Like, it looks like most movies, which is just also, I think, for all his like with like a lot of the shots of Matt Damon having a conversation, which are, again, I don't think particularly well filmed, but and it's funny that, again, it goes to like, it is interesting that, I mean, part of it also makes me think of this really long Hollywood history where that period of films, the 50s and 60s, where they were hiring people to make sets and stuff, and that's just not something they're going to do anymore. But it is the kind of film where you would assume that would happen still. If you were like, okay, I thought it was 250, but you said 300 something million. You're like, certainly they can build a scene for this. But it kind of says a lot about contemporary Hollywood that they're like, shot in the most expensive film, I guess the only one to ever shoot in that, fully in it. And then he did that with Oppenheimer with the black and white IMAX film, which I don't think existed until he made it. So like all this money, and it's like he can't just hire people to build a set and has to film it, which I'm sure there were, like incentives to film in occupied Western Sahara. Even though we don't really see it. I mean, it's only, I think from what I could find, people were like, oh, it was only in it for 20 seconds. So it was like, okay, why did you even need to? You couldn't have shot that in LA back in the day. They would have just been like, that's Santa Barbara, that's, like, or whatever. Like, so there's that weird part. And then the other thing I think that is fascinating about his movies that he does that I don't think exists, say, like in Spielberg or Zemeckis, and when we think of like the appropriative language, is like he has that, which it feels like it is showing off the resources too. You've used that, I think, frame before him to me, is like he'll have like handheld camera work in a situation that, I think of that coming from like naturalist filmmaking, real, like Cassavetes, or people doing, like oppressed groups of people doing a, kind of embedded thing about their lives, kind of things like that comes from documentary, using those techniques to be like, we're in the ship. It's like rich guy cinema. It's just like we're in the ship, and it feels so. It's just fascinating because you go back to an era where people would have built a ship that, would have been like, they'd have been like, oh, that's going to be on screen a lot. Like we built, that took the 2 months to build. It's such a fascinating, kind of the way things trickle up, like the humanization things trickle up from like more, not wealthy filmmaker techniques. And so like he has all this handheld camera work inside the ship that it seems like, yes, it's supposed to humanize Odysseus and all the characters involved, but it's also such a strange, going to what we were saying about him being a trickster and these other things, that kind of can't appear in those kinds of scenes where it's like, I don't know, to the extent that we'd see anything sexual, I guess that would be a kind of shooting style that would be, you know, because you think a 70s film, like, for sure, like, even someone like a Barbara Hammer, you know, like where it's like you're trying to shoot the body. A lot of B movies shot stuff like that, where they're, except it actually had geometry in it. But like, it is it's weird how it's appropriated, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like from that style, where you're like, oh, this is hundreds of $1 million using this because it's trying to borrow from a technique from sort of the cinema of, you know, maybe oppressed is a little, not always the case, but it's just that's so fascinating with me. That always feels a little frustrating with him, where I'm like, can't you just build a big set and it look nice? Like, I'm
Well, this is where you have to credit another shitty series with Matt Damon. It's the fucking Bourne Identity.
Yeah.
It's the Bourne movies where they, because Matt Damon can't fight, and there's no way he gonna look like he's definitely not gonna look like Bruce. He's not gonna look like Jean-Claude Van Damme. So you're gonna have to find a way with the camera to kind of suggest that, you know, he's doing that. And then the other big film that did a lot of it was Winter Soldier, Captain America. Because they went from the standard kind of Marvel big thing to kind of make it with all the gunfire in it. They wanted to, and I forgot who directed that one. Was that the Russo brothers who directed that one? I think it was. I think I remember reading them specifically saying they wanted the film to feel more like that kind of action movie. And then, so I think that there's like this, so like, and they were specifically saying we're gonna take those, like, you know, real cinema techniques, right, and break it in. So for them, yeah, like this is like where like Nolan's like, let's go handheld. We're gonna go handheld now, and now it's, you know, it's going to get real and visceral, right? And it's so it's just so corny because they don't really have language. They have like shitty country club speak when it comes to movies. You know, and that's like the part of the shitty. Let's go handheld in the boat. Yeah, you know, it'll be exciting.
One quick clarification just on the money piece, but yeah, so you're right. We're both sort of right, Gemma, but it's 250 million was the production budget, and then they spent another 125 million just to promote it. Like that's just global. They're like
half
global
the movie. Half the movie. That's nuts.
Yeah. Which is why you see it. It's also why you see it everywhere. And honestly, like you were talking about this, Gemma, in the San Francisco episode that you all did on, on Boots Riley's recent movie, but you were talking about like just that studios actually do just pay bots now, or not bots, but like, well, maybe bots, but sometimes, but also influencers, right? Like they'll give money to influencers to review, talk about, like create discourse, right? And so like
we're not being
also,
paid.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just to say that like some of what we see in terms of discussion online is also probably a product of them seeding all of that as a part of their promotional budget, in addition to all of the TV and everything else that we're seeing on it. So
I also wonder to that extent, sorry, this was something I discovered because of Mtume's Marvel reference. When I rewatched Interstellar, I was like, oh, this is why the Doctor Strange movies exist. Because, you know, like, if anyone remembers that there's a baseball game they play in multiple dimensions, it's so bad. I'm like, God, I was so angry by the end of this film. I had not seen it. My partner had like watched it a bunch and like growing up and like knew the lines. And I was like, I cannot like, but I was like, oh wow, he's actually like the avant-garde quote of this is him creating the things for Marvel movies, you know, and it's kind of this conversation back and forth that people like to think, oh well, you know, Christopher Nolan, so he's, you know, it's like I said this in a different podcast we did in San Francisco about mumblecore, where he's like, no one knows I'm, you know, there's that meme, and it's like he's like the artsy one, and it's like this is like this thing where they create each other, you know, where it's like there's not really a big difference between this and a Marvel movie, and it's almost more like, I think when you sent out notes, Jay, was like it feels more insidious because people kind of can't accept that it could have as many right-wing politics or whatever. Like people can kind of understand that, like Captain America, for example, to pick the most obvious example, is like a military propaganda tool, but they're not necessarily going to think that with this. And then you look at the films and you're like, to Mtume's part about like what are we going to do in the future? I'm like, I'm sure we will see something crop up around this, because they kind of want they want the market, right? They want like they're trying to figure out what can be the next, vampire movie or whatever, or superhero movie, so like this is also what this is kind of auditioning for too. And so those are all wrapped up in it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and just the creation of like, movie stars and celebrities in a certain way, right? Like, I mean, just the overlap to have Tom Holland and Zendaya both in this and in Spider-Man and being out in the theaters at the same time, right? And like you said, like, I mean, Nolan obviously does come out of like, he grows in fame and becomes a big, like, recognized on a big scale when he gets the Batman movies, right? And he does DC. So, there is that. I mean, I don't think you can escape comic book cinema at this point in our country and in our world, and which is just so weird, because I think also about growing up for like Mtume and I growing up in like the 80s and 90s, like it was such a poor period for that. Like there was none of, like it was very hard. I mean, we had Superman, and those movies were terrible, like the Christopher Reeve Superman. And then, it was not really till X-Men that you finally get something that people started to like, and then it gets built upon. But yeah.
I do want to say, I think one more thing actually that I had wanted to talk about, I forgot to write notes, that I think you kind of have just peaked, like also with the Odyssey, being obsessed with the Odyssey. There is an aspect of Christopher Nolan, kind of like the tech bro thing, that's very Revenge of the Nerds. Like, I think that that's unquestionably the case in what people pull out of it. And they're like, okay, I mean, he is basically Robert Zemeckis, Michael Bay, but people think there's intelligent, like, and I think some of what people like is it's like, and especially Inception was like the peak of this, where they're like, no, the top, you don't understand, it's, and even the Batman, and it's also how long the movies are. Like if he was making 90-minute, 2-hour movies, people wouldn't be like, oh, there's, this is so there is like it is what you're, I mean, people have talked about the superhero movies in general about this, right? How like nerd culture has gone, quote unquote. And of course, this is where fan culture comes from, arguably, like is comics and, like the 50s and stuff. So like, it does feel like that is also some of the defense of it, is this kind of like Revenge of the Nerds thing, that it's like, oh, these are all in quotes, like, oh, he's a nerd. And there's like, he brings intellectual ideas to the cinema in a way that during the blockbuster period of American cinema, like the 80s and 90s, wasn't happening, and I think you're right that there weren't comic book movies, but then it's also the other side of like, is he that different from Back to the Future? You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't really think he is.
I mean, that was the whole discourse around Batman, was that Burton's Batman was silly and like, a kind of corny thing, and that he was making Batman real, which I'm like, okay, he defies physics. He's not real. Like, stop it. Like, why? Because the Batmobile looks like a tank, right? Like, that's why it's real, right? Oh, yeah, Liam Neeson's Ra's al Ghul, right? Real, but that was like kind of the thought that he was intelligent enough to finally bring those things down to the level of humanity, right? Which I never bought. I thought it was like the worst argument. And when Bale went, I was like, I'm out. I fuck these movies. I cannot take that shit. It is terrible, right? But yeah, that's always been kind of like the argument for his movies from the Batman thing on. And yeah, but I agree with you, Gemma. There is this investment. There is way too much investment in the kind of film culture world, in this idea that, yeah, we know all this stuff is fucked up, but we just need the great filmmaker. And as it's this concept that we need this person no matter what it means. Like, I did have someone literally say to me, yes, the movie has a lot of problems, but you have to respect the attempt. And I said, we're not having conversations.
People have constantly said, I respect the ambition, which I don't. It's such a. You see that in a bunch of reviews that are negative. That I said a negative review of it, and I was like, I don't. Isn't that the thing that's the worst about it? Like, I don't even like. It's like, well,
And it's just a product of like money too, right? Like, I mean, that's the thing, is like you get $250 million to make a movie, and like spend it. You know what I mean? So I don't like, that's not, I don't know, the ambition thing. I mean, he did say in one of the interviews I saw that like he didn't think he would have been given the budget and the investment to make this movie until Oppenheimer was like won the Academy Award basically and all of that. And so you know, and yeah. And of course people are already showering this with Oscar discussion, which is like just wild, you know, but it will. All right. Anything else y'all wanted to get to? I can read Matt Damon's response to the Song of the Sirens if anyone wants.
Close us out with that one.
Do it
All
in
right.
a Boston accent though, like he's a Good Will Hunting.
I can't. I could if it was like I can do Good Will Hunting, but I don't think I can do. I'm not ready for my R's today. Park the card, Harvard Yard. All right. So this is him explaining to someone who asks, because they all wax their ears for the Song of the Siren, except for one dude who takes the wax out and goes nuts and jumps overboard and swims to the sirens. But Matt Damon doesn't put wax in his ears, and he has them tie him to the mast of the ship. So he's explaining it to them. It was everything you want it to be. And it was everything you wished you never wished for. It was the delicious itch that you go to scratch to find that it's under the skin and you can't reach it. So the delicious itch becomes unbearable. It told you what you most want is that you can't have. And what you most can't have is what you already had and lost. It is the song of all the promises I failed to keep. And it told me that I don't really want to go home. That's it, folks.
That's what you say when you've had like 5 drinks at the bar and you're trying to be deep, right? And then like someone tells you like, yo, like you were like, what did I say last night? Like, you just forget about it. Just, you know, homie, it's okay. It's okay.
All right. On that fine note, I did not take theater in school. This is all au naturel, folks.
Theater.
All right. Thank you so much, Mtume and Jemma. Apologies for, submitting you both to this process.
Was worth it.
But I definitely needed and appreciate both of your insights. Thank you for the work that you all do, folks. Make sure to check out. Will the channel
do more current movies? Because that's been a debate.
I don't know. Yeah. This one I felt like I had to. I mean, and I guess one last thing to say is I have a real problem with like investment in civilizational discourses, just broadly speaking.
Yeah.
Like I think that is just, it's just a reactionary kind of impulse in general.
Yeah.
Like, and we didn't probably talk about that much, but like this whole like concern that the film had about the fall of civilization, and the same way that you see that concern played out, particularly among liberals right now, but also among conservatives in different ways. Like a lot of those debates that we see are like their debates about, yes, they kind of all agree civilization has fallen, but now it's a question of like, well, what do we go back to or try to salvage?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, just let it go. Just burn it down. Anyways. All right. Peace, everybody. Thank you.
Peace.
Yeah.